Extracts from V.L. Lenin and Leonid Brezhnev, and from the writings of Soviet statesmen and military leaders, exposing propaganda lies of a Soviet war threat and showing the danger to peace presented by aggressive imperialist forces and the peaking hegemonists. Progress Publishers. Modern militarism is a product of imperialism. From the works of V.I. Lenin. Modern militarism is the result of capitalism. In both its forms it is the vital expression of capitalism as a military force used by the capitalist states in their external conflicts and as a weapon in the hands of the ruling classes for suppressing every kind of movement, economic and political, of the proletariat. Bellicose Militarism, Collected Works, Volume 15, Progress Publishers, Moscow, p. 192. World domination is, to put it briefly, the substance of imperialist policy, of which imperialist war is the continuation. A Caricature of Marxism, Collected Works, Volume 23, p. 35. Some foolish people are shouting about red militarism. These are political crooks who pretend that they believe this absurdity and throw charges of this kind right and left, exercising their lawyers' skill in concocting plausible arguments and in throwing dust in the eyes of the masses. Achievements and Difficulties, Collected Works, Volume 29, p. 66. Imperialism is, by virtue of its fundamental economic traits, distinguished by a minimum fondness for peace and freedom, and by a maximum and universal development of militarism. The Proletarian Revolution and Renegade Kautsky, Collected Works, Volume 28, p. 239. The states that call themselves civilized, are now engaged. 5. In a mad armaments hurdle race. In thousands of ways, in thousands of newspapers, from thousands of pulpits, they shout and clamor about patriotism, culture, native land, peace, and progress in order to justify new expenditures for all manner of weapons of destruction. Ladies and gentlemen, one feels like saying about all these phrases mouthed by patriots, so-called. Put no faith in phrase-mongering, it is better to see who stands to gain v. Who Stands to Gain, Collected Works, Volume 19, p. 53. War equals a terribly profitable thing equals the direct and inevitable product of capitalism. May Day and the War, Collected Works, Volume 36, p. 325. The American multimillionaires were, perhaps, richest of all, and geographically the most secure. They have profited more than all the rest. They have converted all, even the richest, countries into their tributaries. They have grabbed hundreds of billions of dollars. And every dollar is sullied with filth, the filth of the secret treaties between Britain and her allies, between Germany and her vassals, treaties for the division of the spoils, treaties of mutual aid for oppressing the workers and persecuting the internationalist socialists. Every dollar is sullied with the filth of profitable war contracts, which in EV country made the rich richer and the poor poorer. And every dollar is stained with blood from that ocean of blood that has been shed by the 10 million killed and 20 million maimed in the great, noble, liberating and holy war to decide whether the British or the German robbers are to get most of the spoils, whether the British or the German thugs are to be foremost in throttling the weak nations all over the world. While the German robbers broke all records in war atrocities, the British have broken all records not only in the number of colonies they have grabbed, but also in the subtlety of their disgusting hypocrisy. This very day, the Anglo-French and American bourgeois newspapers are spreading, in millions and millions of copies, lies and slander about Russia, and are hypocritically justifying their predatory expedition against her on the plea that they want to protect Russia from the Germans. It does not require many words to refute this despicable and hideous lie, it is sufficient to point to one well-known fact. In October 1917, after the Russian workers had overthrown their imperialist government, the Soviet government, the government of the revolutionary workers and peasants, openly proposed a just peace, a peace without annexations or indemnities, a peace that fully guaranteed equal rights to all nations, and it proposed such a peace to all the belligerent countries. It was the Anglo-French and the American bourgeoisie who refused to accept our proposal, it was they who even refused to talk to us about a general peace. It was they who betrayed the interests of all nations, it was they who prolonged the imperialist slaughter. Letter to American Workers, Collected Works, Volume 28, pages 64–65. An end to wars, peace among the nations, the cessation of pillaging and violence, such is our ideal. The Question of Peace, Collected Works, Volume 21, p. 293. We have started a resolute struggle against the war brought on by the clash of robbers over their spoils. Until now all parties have spoken of this struggle but have not gone beyond words and hypocrisy. Now the struggle for peace is on. It is a difficult struggle. It is highly naive to think that peace can be easily attained, and that the bourgeoisie will hand it to us on a platter as soon as we mention it. Those who ascribed this view to the Bolsheviks were cheating. Speech at the First All-Russia Congress of the Navy, November 22, 1917, Collected Works, Volume 26, p. -345. We will, of course, insist upon the whole of our program for a peace. We are combating the deception practiced by 7. Governments which pay lip service to peace and justice but in fact wage annexationist and predatory wars. Second All-Russia Congress of Soviets of Workers and Soldiers Deputies, October 25–26, 1917, Collected Works, Volume 26, p. 252. We shall do our utmost to preserve peace in the future, that we shall not shrink from great sacrifices and concessions in order to safeguard this peace. There are, however, limits beyond which one cannot go. We shall not permit peace treaties to be flouted. We shall not permit attempts to interfere with our peaceful work. On no account shall we permit this, and we shall rise to a man to defend our existence. 9th All-Russia Congress of Soviets, December 23–28, 1921, Collected Works, Volume 33, p. 149. If at the moment they cannot attack us with guns, they attack us with lies and slander. Speech at the plenary meeting of the Moscow Soviet of Workers and Peasants Deputies, February 28, 1921, Collected Works, Volume 32, p. 159. When the bourgeoisie's ideological influence on the workers declines, is undermined or weakened, the bourgeoisie everywhere and always resorts to the most outrageous lies and slander. The bourgeois intelligentsia's methods of struggle against the workers, Collected Works, Volume 20, p. 485. But the measures we take for peace must be accompanied by intensified preparedness for defense. Our army offers a real guarantee that the imperialist powers will not make the slightest attempt or encroachment on us, for although they might count on certain ephemeral successes at first, not one of them would escape defeat at the hands of Soviet Russia. 8. 9th Congress of the RCP, March 29 to April 5, 1920, Collected Works, Volume 30, p. 453. We have reiterated and reiterated our desire for peace, our need for peace. But we do not propose to be strangled to death for the sake of peace. Interview with Lincoln Eyre, correspondent of the American newspaper The World, Collected Works, Volume 42, p. 177. Our cause is strong, no matter what attempts are made to invade Russia and no matter what military moves are made against us, and in all probability many more will be made. All these attempts will go up in smoke, as we know from our actual experience, which has steeled us. After every such attempt by our enemies, we shall emerge stronger than ever. Speech delivered at a conference of chairmen of Uyezd, Volost, and village executive committees of Moscow Gubernia, October 15, 1920, Collected Works, Volume 31, p. 329. Having started on our work of peaceful development, we shall exert every effort to continue it without interruption. At the same time, comrades, be vigilant, safeguard the defense potential of our country, strengthen our Red Army to the utmost. 9th All-Russia Congresses, Collected Works, Volume 33, p. 151. Win peace and security for all nations. From the speeches and writings of Leonid Brezhnev. From the Central Committee Report to the 24th Congress of the CPSU, March 30, 1971. Whenever imperialists want to cover up an aggressive scheme, they try to revive the lie of a Soviet threat. They seek evidence of this threat in the depths of the Indian Ocean and on the peaks of the Cordilleras. And, of course, if seen through NATO field glasses, the plains of Europe are teeming with Soviet divisions poised for a leap against the West. But the peoples will not be deceived by any attempts to ascribe to the Soviet Union intentions which are alien to it. We declare with all emphasis, we have no territorial claims on anyone, we threaten no one, and have no intention of attacking anyone, we stand for the free and independent development of all nations. But let no one try and talk to us in terms of ultimatums and from positions of strength. We have all the requisites: a genuine peace policy, military might, and the unity of Soviet people to ensure the inviolability of our borders against any encroachments, and to defend the gains of socialism. Comrades, the period under review marked the end of the quarter-century since the rout of Hitler Germany and militarist Japan. The fruits of that great victory still live in the international realities of today. The Soviet people cherish everything attained at such great cost. For more than 25 years now, our people have lived in peace. We regard this as the greatest achievement of our party's foreign policy. For a quarter-century now, humanity has been spared a world war. That is another historic achievement of the peoples, to which the Soviet Union and its foreign policy have made a considerable contribution. The forces of aggression and militarism 10. Have been pushed back, but they have not been rendered harmless. In the post-war years, they have started more than 30 wars and armed conflicts of varying scale. Nor can we consider the danger of another world war as having been completely eliminated. And it is the vital task of all peaceable states, of all peoples, to prevent this danger. The Soviet Union has countered the aggressive policy of imperialism. With its policy of active defense of peace and strengthening of international security. The main principles of our policy are well known. Our party, our Soviet state, in cooperation with the fraternal socialist countries and other peace-loving states, and with the wholehearted support of many millions of people throughout the world, have now for many years been following these principles in the struggle for peace and friendship among nations. The CPSU regards the following as the basic concrete tasks of this struggle in the present situation. First, to eliminate the hotbeds of war in Southeast Asia and the Middle East and to promote a political settlement in these areas on the basis of respect for the legitimate rights of states and peoples subjected to aggression, to rebuff immediately and firmly any acts of aggression and international arbitrariness. For this, full use must also be made of the possibilities of the United Nations, to make renunciation of the use or threat of force in settling outstanding issues a law of international life. The Soviet Union invites all countries that accept this standpoint to conclude appropriate bilateral or regional treaties. Second, to proceed from the final recognition of the territorial changes that took place in Europe as a result of the Second World War, and bring about a radical turn towards détente and peace on this continent, to secure the convocation and success of the European Conference, to work for collective security in Europe. We reaffirm the readiness expressed jointly by the participants in the defensive Warsaw Treaty to annul the treaty simultaneously with the annulment of the North Atlantic Alliance or as a first step to dismantle their military organizations. Third, to conclude treaties outlawing nuclear, chemical, and bacteriological weapons. 41. To work for an end to the testing of nuclear weapons, including underground testing, by everyone everywhere, to promote the establishment of nuclear-free zones in various parts of the world. We stand for the nuclear disarmament of all states in possession of nuclear weapons, and for the convocation for this purpose of a conference of the 5 nuclear powers: the USSR, the USA, China, France, and Britain. Fourth, to step up the struggle for halting the race in all types of weapons, we favor convocation of a world conference to consider disarmament questions to the fullest extent. We stand for dismantling foreign military bases, and for reducing armed forces and armaments in areas where the military confrontation is especially dangerous, above all in Central Europe. We consider it advisable to work out measures reducing the probability of accidental outbreak or deliberate fabrication of armed incidents and their development into international crises, into war. The Soviet Union is prepared to negotiate agreements on reducing military expenditure, above all by the major powers. Fifth, the UN decisions on the abolition of the remaining colonial regimes must be fully carried out. Manifestations of racism and apartheid must be universally condemned and boycotted. Sixth, the Soviet Union is prepared to expand mutually advantageous cooperation in every sphere with states that want the same thing. Our country is prepared to join other states concerned in resolving such problems as the conservation of the environment, development of power and other natural resources, development of transport and communications, prevention and eradication of the most dangerous and widespread diseases, and exploration and development of outer space and the world ocean. Those are the main objectives of our party's program of struggle for peace and international cooperation, for the freedom and independence of nations. And we declare that, while consistently pursuing its policy of peace and friendship among nations, the Soviet Union will continue resolutely to combat imperialism, and firmly to rebuff the 12. Evil designs and subversions of aggressors. As in the past, we shall give undeviating support to the people's struggle for democracy, national liberation, and socialism. From the Central Committee Report to the 25th Congress of the CPSU, February 24, 1976. Efforts to end the arms race and to promote disarmament have been and remain, as the peace program requires, one of the main trends in the foreign political activity of the CPSU and the Soviet government. Today, this objective is more vital than ever. Though mankind is tired of sitting upon mountains of arms, the arms race spurred on by aggressive imperialist groups is becoming more intensive. The main motive for the arms race given by its advocates is the so-called Soviet threat. They invoke this motive when they want to drag through a larger military budget while reducing allocations for social needs, and when they develop new types of deadly weapons, and when they try to justify NATO's military activity. The truth, of course, is that there is no Soviet threat either for the West or the East. All that is a monstrous lie from beginning to end. The Soviet Union has not the slightest intention of attacking anyone. The Soviet Union does not need war. The Soviet Union does not increase its military budget, and is steadily increasing rather than reducing allocations for improving the people's well-being. Our country is consistently and staunchly fighting for peace, and making one concrete arms reduction and disarmament proposal after another. The Soviet Communists are proud of having undertaken the difficult but noble mission of standing in the front ranks of the drive to deliver the peoples from the dangers that ensue from the continuing arms race. Our party calls on all the peoples, all the countries, to unite their efforts and end this perilous process. General and complete disarmament has been and remains our ultimate goal in this field. At the same time, the Soviet Union is doing all it can to achieve progress along separate sections of the road leading to this goal. J3. The 24th Congress set this objective, to make renunciation of the use or threat of force in settling outstanding issues a law of international life. Later, this principle was reflected in a number of treaties concluded by the USSR with other countries. It is included in the final act of the European Conference. To make the danger of war recede still farther and to create favorable conditions for progress towards disarmament, we now offer to conclude a world treaty on the non-use of force in international relations. Its participants, naturally including the nuclear powers, would undertake to refrain from using all types of weapons, including nuclear, in settling disputes that may arise between them. The Soviet Union is prepared to join other states in examining practical steps leading to the implementation of this proposal. Assessing our country's international situation and world conditions, the party's Central Committee considers that further struggle for peace and the freedom and independence of the peoples now requires first of all fulfillment of the following vital tasks, while steadily strengthening their unity and expanding their all-round cooperation in building the new society. The fraternal socialist states must augment their joint active contribution to the consolidation of peace. Work for the termination of the expanding arms race, which is endangering peace, and for transition to reducing the accumulated stockpiles of arms, to disarmament. For this purpose, a. Do everything to complete the preparation of a new Soviet-US agreement on limiting and reducing strategic armaments, and conclude international treaties on the universal and complete termination of nuclear weapons tests, on banning and destroying chemical weapons, on banning development of new types and systems of mass annihilation weapons, and also banning modification of the natural environment for military or other hostile purposes. b. Launch new efforts to activate negotiations on the reduction of armed forces and armaments in Central Europe. Following agreement on the first concrete steps in this direction, continue to promote military détente in the region in later years. c. Work for a switch from the present continuous growth of 14. The military expenditure of many states to the practice of their systematic reduction. d. Take all measures to assure the earliest possible convocation of a World Disarmament Conference. Concentrate the efforts of peace-loving states on eliminating the remaining seats of war, first and foremost on implementing a just and durable settlement in the Middle East. In connection with such a settlement, the states concerned should examine the question of helping to end the arms race in the Middle East. Do everything to deepen international détente, to embody it in concrete forms of mutually beneficial cooperation between states. Work vigorously for the full implementation of the final act of the European Conference, and for greater peaceful cooperation in Europe. In accordance with the principles of peaceful coexistence, continue consistently to develop relations of long-term mutually beneficial cooperation in various fields: political, economic, scientific, and cultural with the United States of America, France, the FRG, Britain, Italy, Canada, and also Japan and other capitalist countries. Work for ensuring Asian security based on joint efforts by the states of that continent. Work for a world treaty on the non-use of force in international relations. Consider as crucial the international task of completely eliminating all vestiges of the system of colonial oppression and encroachment on the equality and independence of peoples, and of all seats of colonialism and racialism. Work for eliminating discrimination and all artificial barriers in international trade, and all manifestations of inequality, diktat, and exploitation in international economic relations. These, comrades, are the main tasks, the attainment of which, as we see it, is essential at present in the interests of peace and the security of peoples, and the progress of mankind. We consider these proposals an organic projection and development of the peace program advanced by our 24th Congress, a program of further struggle for peace and international cooperation and for the freedom and independence of the peoples. We shall direct our foreign policy efforts towards achieving these tasks, shall cooperate in this with other peace-loving states. 15. From the speech at the Conference for Peace, Security, Cooperation, and Social Progress in Europe, Berlin, 29–30 June 1976. The success of international détente has inspired and strengthened the forces of peace and progress, and has heightened their prestige and influence among the people. It has shown that the positions of the realistically thinking representatives of the ruling circles in the bourgeois countries rest on solid ground. But it has also alerted and activated the forces of reaction and militarism, who would like to drag Europe and the entire world back to the Cold War and the time of nuclear brinkmanship. It has alarmed those who wax fat on the production of weapons of death and destruction, who cannot envisage any other political career except that of launching crusades against the socialist countries, against communists, and those who openly call for preparing for a new war, as the Maoist leaders in China are doing in the hope of benefiting from the setting of countries and peoples against one another. These different forces oppose détente in different ways. However, their main objective is to further accelerate the arms race, which is already of an unprecedented scope. To do this, imperialism's aggressive forces and their henchmen have again resorted to the hackneyed myth about the notorious Soviet threat supposedly looming over the Western countries. Fantastic assertions grossly distorting the policy of the Soviet Union and the other socialist states constantly appear in the mass media and are quite often made by prominent officials. Against all common sense, the socialist countries are held responsible for internal political events in other states and for civil wars, and wars of national liberation. Ordinary people are being intimidated by hordes of Russian tanks, and are being told that the USSR and the other Warsaw Treaty countries are building up arms on a tremendous scale, preparing a war against Western Europe. But these fabrications collapse like a house of cards as soon as we look at facts, at the realities. In Central Europe there is not much difference in the size. 16. Of the armed forces of the Warsaw Treaty and NATO countries. Their level has remained more or less equal for many years. And the Western powers know that as well as we do. That is why the socialist countries propose that an equal reduction of armed forces and armaments for each side be agreed upon, not to change the correlation of forces, but to reduce the side's military spending and lessen the risk of a clash. What could be more logical and fair? But no, the NATO countries are stubbornly trying to secure an unequal reduction, so that the correlation of forces would change in their favor and to the detriment of the socialist countries. Obviously, we cannot accept this, and our Western partners in the talks apparently realize it themselves. So their position can mean only one thing: slowing down the talks and impeding the reduction of armed forces and armaments in Central Europe. It was the Soviet Union which proposed that the states taking part in the talks on the reduction of armed forces and armaments in Central Europe undertake an obligation not to increase the strength of their armed forces while the talks are in progress. But this proposal wasn't accepted by the West either. NATO continues to build up the numbers and the striking power of its combat units in Central Europe. So who really wants to lessen the threat of war in Europe and who is helping increase it? The Soviet Union is the only great power which does not increase its military spending every year, and which is working for a generally agreed reduction in military budgets. At the same time, the United States military budget is steadily growing, already exceeding $100,000 million. And the West European NATO member countries more than doubled their military spending in the 5 years between 1971 and 1975. Such is reality. It speaks for itself. Let us recall some more vivid facts. It was the Soviet Union that has made the important proposals that a world treaty be signed on the non-use of force in international relations, and that a general ban on the development of new types and systems of mass destruction weapons be imposed. Their proposals were widely acclaimed throughout the world, but, unfortunately, we see no great desire on the part of the governments of the Western powers to implement them. At the Soviet-US talks on the further limitation of strategic arms, the Soviet Union has officially proposed that an agreement be reached on rejecting the development of new, even more destructive types of weapons, such as the U.S. missile-carrying Trident submarines and the BL strategic bombers and similar systems in the Soviet Union. But the United States has rejected our proposals and started working on these new means of mass destruction. It was the Soviet Union which proposed to the USA that an agreement be reached on the removal of Soviet and American warships and nuclear missile-carrying submarines from the Mediterranean. But our proposal was rejected. It was the Soviet Union which proposed a treaty on the complete and universal banning of nuclear weapon tests. This proposal was broadly supported in the UN. However, the other nuclear powers refused to begin talks on this kind of agreement. All these proposals still stand. Most of them, along with other concrete proposals, are included in the program of further struggle for peace and international cooperation, and for the freedom and independence of the peoples, which was approved by the 25th CPSU Congress and which our party and our state are working to implement. I think, comrades, that what I have said is enough for a correct answer as to who is really trying to bridle the arms race and who is spurring it on. From a speech at the plenum of the CCCPSU October 25, 1976. Today there is no greater task in the struggle for lasting peace than to put an end to the arms race unleashed by the imperialist powers and to go over to disarmament. The fact 18. Is that aggressive circles in the capitalist world are stepping up frantic military preparations in face of their defeats in social battles, their loss of colonial possessions, the increasing number of countries rejecting capitalism, the successes of world socialism, and the growing influence of communist parties in bourgeois states. The military budgets are swelling, new types of weapons are being developed and new bases set up. There are military demonstrations. By acting from positions of strength, Imperialism hopes to hang on to the possibility of dominating other countries and peoples, which is slipping out of its hands. To prop up their policy ideologically, as it were, the imperialist inspirers of the arms race stick at nothing, and are not even particularly concerned about elementary logic. When they want more money to buy armaments, they frighten their parliaments and the public with references to superior Soviet strength, and when they want to show the electorate how well they have looked after defense, they assure them of the absolute military superiority of the West. As for us, we spend exactly as much on defense as is necessary to ensure the Soviet Union's security, to safeguard the gains of socialism jointly with the fraternal countries, and to discourage potential aggressors from attempting to settle the historical competition between the two opposite social systems in their favor by force of arms. To keep the country's armed forces at a high level, so that Soviet soldiers should always have the most up-to-date weaponry that imperialists could not afford to ignore, this is a sacred duty to the people, and we shall never fail to fulfill it. At the same time, we have no greater desire than to use the resources that are now necessarily diverted from the national economy for raising the people's living standard, for constructive purposes. We are prepared, even starting tomorrow, to carry out disarmament measures either large and radical or, for a start, only partial, provided this is done on a truly fair and reciprocal basis. There'll be no hitch where we are concerned. From outstanding exploit of Tula's defenders' speech during the presentation of a Gold Star Medal to the hero city of Tula January 18, 1977. Soviet people fervently approve of the party's foreign policy. They know that it is designed to safeguard their country against war, that it accords with the interests of all nations, that it opens opportunities for friendship and cooperation, and that it advances the cause of social progress throughout the world. At many meetings and rallies, in thousands upon thousands of letters to the Central Committee of the CPSU, to newspapers, and to the radio and television, they praise the Central Committee, its Politburo, and the Soviet government for the unremitting struggle for peace. No other country has offered the world such a sweeping, concrete, and realistic program for lessening and then fully eliminating the danger of another war. The Soviet program includes such a global measure as concluding a world treaty on the non-use of force in international relations. It encompasses all the key problems related to the arms race and charts effective measures to curb it, and to achieve disarmament. It is aimed at preventing the appearance of new types and new systems of mass destruction weapons, and at completely banning nuclear tests. The Soviet Union has offered the United States to refrain on a reciprocal basis from developing new types of submarines and strategic bombers. All our peaceful initiatives accord with the common political line of the fraternal socialist countries in the international arena. We are working together for their implementation. The proposals of the Soviet Union and its friends are supported by dozens of countries in the United Nations and by the mass of the people on all continents. Certainly, we are improving our defenses. There is no other choice. We have never taken our own security or that of our allies lightly, and never will. But the talk that the Soviet Union is going beyond what it 20 actually needs for its defense, that it wants superiority in weapons in order to deliver the first strike, is absurd and entirely groundless. Not so long ago, at a meeting with a group of prominent U.S. businessmen, I have already said, and want to repeat today, that the Soviet Union is, and always has been, a convinced opponent of any such notions. Our efforts are directed precisely to averting any first strike and any second strike, and indeed to averting nuclear war in general. Our approach to the matter can be put as follows: the defense potential of the Soviet Union must be big enough to deter anyone from disrupting our peaceful life. Our policy is not to win superiority in weapons but to reduce them, to ease the military confrontation. On behalf of the party and the entire people, I hereby declare that our country will never take the road of aggression, will never raise the sword against other nations. Not we but certain forces in the West are stepping up the arms race, and particularly the nuclear arms race. Not we but the forces that fling hundreds of billions into the bottomless pit of military preparations, are to blame for the growth of military budgets. These forces represent the aggressive line in the international affairs of today under the false pretext of a Soviet threat. From the Great October Revolution and Mankind's Progress Report in the Kremlin Palace of Congresses at a joint meeting of the Central Committee of the CPSU, the Supreme Soviet of the USSR and the Supreme Soviet of the RSFSR November 2, 1977. Soviet power was established under the sign of Lenin's Decree on Peace, and ever since our country's entire foreign policy has been one of peace. Objective historical conditions have dictated its content as the peaceful coexistence of states with different social systems. In our day, the principles of peaceful coexistence have by and large taken firm root in international affairs as the only realistic. 21. And reasonable principles. This is a result of the changed correlation of forces in the world, above all, of the growth of the strength and international prestige of the Soviet Union and the socialist community as a whole. It is also a result of the successes of the international working class movement and the forces of national liberation. And finally, it is a result of the acceptance of the new realities by a certain section of the ruling circles in the capitalist world. At the same time, it is a result of the tremendous work done in recent years by the Soviet Union and other countries of the socialist community to reshape international relations in the direction of peace. International relations are now at a crossroads, as it were, which could lead either to a growth of confidence and cooperation, or to a growth of mutual fears, suspicion, and arms stockpiles, a crossroads leading ultimately either to lasting peace or, at best, to a balancing on the brink of war. Détente offers the opportunity for choosing the road of peace. To miss this opportunity would be a crime. The most important and pressing task now is to halt the arms race, which has engulfed the world. Regrettably, the arms build-up continues and is acquiring ever more dangerous forms. New varieties and types of mass destruction weapons are being developed, and it is well known on whose initiative this is being done. But every new type represents an equation with several unknown quantities in terms of political as well as military, technical or strategic consequences. Swinging from one type of arms to another apparently with the naive hope of retaining a monopoly on them only accelerates the arms race, heightens mutual distrust, and hampers disarmament measures. In this connection I would like, most forcefully, to reaffirm something I have said before. The Soviet Union is effectively ensuring its defense capability, but it does not, and will not seek military superiority to the other side. We do not seek to upset the present approximate equilibrium of military strength, say, between East and West in Central Europe, or between the USSR and the USA. But in return we insist that no one else should seek to upset it in his favor. Needless to say, maintaining the existing equilibrium is not 22. An end in itself. We are in favor of twisting the curve of the arms race downward and gradually scaling down the level of military confrontation. We want to reduce substantially and then eliminate the threat of nuclear war, the most formidable danger facing humanity. That is the objective of the well-known proposals made by the Soviet Union and other socialist countries. Today we are proposing a radical step, that agreement be reached on a simultaneous halt in the production of nuclear weapons by all states. This would apply to all such weapons, whether atomic, hydrogen or neutron bombs or projectiles. At the same time, the nuclear powers could undertake to start on a gradual reduction of the existing stockpiles of such weapons, advancing towards their complete, 100% destruction. The energy of the atom for peaceful purposes only. This is the appeal of the Soviet state in the year of its 60th anniversary to the governments and peoples of the world. Another important task with a direct bearing on the problem of reducing the nuclear war danger is that of seeing through to the end the work of banning nuclear weapons tests, so that such tests are outlawed not only in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater, but also underground. We want to achieve progress in the negotiations on this score and bring them to a successful conclusion. We therefore state that we are prepared, besides a ban on all nuclear weapons tests for a definite period, to reach agreement on a moratorium covering nuclear explosions for peaceful purposes. We trust that this important Soviet initiative will be favorably received by our partners at the negotiations and that the road will thus be cleared for the treaty long awaited by the peoples. The Soviet Union confidently follows the road of peace. We actively and persistently call for the contest between socialism and capitalism to be decided not on the field of battle, not on munitions conveyors, but in the sphere of peaceful work. We want the frontiers dividing the two worlds to be crossed not by flight paths of missiles with nuclear warheads, but by threads of broad and diversified cooperation for the good of all mankind. Our steadfast pursuit of this policy gives practical expression to one of the main rallying cries of the October Revolution, one of Lenin's most important behests, peace to the peoples. 23. From an address on board the cruiser Admiral Siniavine to participants in Pacific Fleet exercises April 7, 1978. It is high time for certain Western leaders to give serious thought to their responsibility to their own nations and all other peoples for the future of peace, and to show real readiness to take effective action and bridle the arms race. The Soviet Union will continue its efforts to secure steady progress of military détente and passage to real disarmament. That is our firm policy, and we will persevere in it. We threaten no one. The talk about a Soviet threat is an obvious invention of the opponents of détente, nothing more. We are buttressing our defenses for one reason only, to dependably defend the gains of the October Revolution, and dependably defend the peaceful labor of Soviet people, of our friends and allies. That lofty aim is well served by the men and officers of the Soviet Army and Navy. From the speech at the 18th Congress of the All-Union Leninist Young Communist League April 25, 1978. Of late, opponents of détente and disarmament in the NATO countries, all those generals who dabble in politics and all those bellicose politicians have been raising a propaganda howl and spreading lies about an allegedly dangerous military superiority of the Warsaw Treaty states to the NATO bloc in Europe, about alleged Soviet aggressive intentions in Europe, and the like. Need I say that all this is utter nonsense? But it is not harmless but malicious nonsense, because it serves to justify and camouflage actions that are truly dangerous and potentially aggressive, those of escalating the arms race, building up military forces, and contaminating the international atmosphere with the poisonous fumes of fear, suspicion, and hostility. More than any other country, the Soviet Union, which suffered 24. The most in the Second World War, wants that peace in Europe should never be violated again, and that Europe should be a continent of lasting peace and peaceful cooperation. And probably no other state has done more for this than our country. Everybody should know that far from harboring any aggressive designs and building up any strike forces in Europe for action against the West, the Soviet Union has always done and will continue to do everything it can to relieve tensions and to facilitate agreement. Unlike the NATO countries, we have not increased our armed forces in Central Europe for a long time, and do not intend, I wish to stress this most emphatically, do not intend to increase them by a single soldier, by a single tank. And we call on the Western states to follow this good example. Imperialist propaganda is trying to distort the meaning and the goals of Soviet foreign policy. It maintains that there is a contradiction between our country's policy of détente and peaceful coexistence and our relations with countries that have thrown off the colonial yoke. The Soviet Union and other socialist countries are being falsely accused of interfering in the affairs of young states. Our opponents go so far as to accuse us of an expansionist policy and of building up tension. All this, of course, is sheer fabrication with no basis in fact. We want friendly cooperation with the developing countries on a basis of complete equality. We support their independence and their advance along the road of peace and social progress. The Soviet Union invariably stands for strict respect for the sovereignty of those and all other states, for non-interference in their internal affairs, and for the inviolability of their frontiers. The imperialist powers which are continuously interfering openly or under flimsy camouflage in the affairs of independent newly free states. They do so in order to obstruct progressive development. They infringe on sovereignty in order to secure the selfish interests of their monopolies or the plans of their military strategists. As a rule, such interference leads to violence and encroachments on the rights of the peoples. This occurs either in the internal life of the countries concerned, as, say, in Chile, or in the form of overt foreign aggression, like the brazen conduct of the Israeli rulers. 25. The facts show that the peoples of the young states are able to defend their independence and vital interests more successfully, the more solid their unity and solidarity and the more solid their friendship is with the countries of the socialist world, on whose support they may rely in their just struggle. Peace, non-interference in each other's internal affairs, respect for other nations' independence and territorial integrity, equality, and mutually beneficial cooperation are indispensable and crucial elements of détente and lasting peace. Such is our policy in Europe, and it is the same in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and everywhere else in the world. And if anyone thinks that the Soviet Union can be diverted from this course by means of slander and threats, he is badly mistaken. Analyzing the world situation, we have come to the firm conviction that it is high time to think of putting a complete stop to any further quantitative and qualitative growth of the armaments and armed forces of states with a large military potential, and thereby pave the way to their subsequent reduction. Specifically, we are calling for discussion of a program of the following measures, to be put into effect within a definite time limit, to stop manufacturing nuclear weapons of all types, to stop manufacturing and to ban all other types of mass destruction weapons, to stop developing new types of highly destructive conventional arms, to renounce the expansion of the armies and the increase of the conventional armaments of the permanent members of the UN Security Council and countries associated with them under military agreements. It is certainly not simple to agree on such matters. We could probably first tackle, let us say, the stopping of nuclear arms manufacture, as we have already proposed. The main thing is that the problem as a whole is made easier to solve by the fact that these steps would not upset the balance of forces now existing between states. Nobody would be the loser. We must not forget, nor have we the right to forget, that the nuclear peril is still hanging over the world and arousing the alarm of nations for their future. Joint efforts by all the nuclear powers are obviously needed to remove this peril. And each of 26 them can and must do its bit. For its part, the Soviet Union declares unambiguously, we are against the use of nuclear weapons, only extraordinary circumstances, an act of aggression against our country or its allies by another nuclear power, could compel us to resort to this extreme means of self-defense. The Soviet Union is doing and will continue to do everything to prevent an atomic war, so that the nations should not fall victim to atomic strikes, neither a first strike nor subsequent ones. This is our firm line, and we shall act accordingly. From L.I. Brezhnev's replies to the questions of Vorwärts, Weekly of the Social Democratic Party of Germany, May 4, 1978. To begin with, allow me to make the main point: the apprehensions you allude to are totally ungrounded. A Soviet military threat to Europe or any other part of the world does not and cannot exist. First of all, let us look at the purely factual aspect of the matter. Regarding Europe, the Western press and certain Western politicians and military figures often claim that in Europe, the Soviet Union and other Warsaw Treaty countries have secured military superiority to the NATO countries and are still building up their armed forces there. To put it mildly, these claims are biased and misleading. First of all, for a number of years now the Soviet Union has not expanded or built up its armed forces in Central Europe, that is, in the area which is now the subject of the Vienna negotiations. Moreover, we and our allies have persistently suggested to the Western side that an agreement should be reached there that both sides explicitly commit themselves not to increase their armed forces and armaments in Central Europe while the Vienna talks are going on. Unfortunately, so far the Western countries have not accepted this proposal. And their practical actions are pulling in the opposite direction. As for superiority, the sides at the said Vienna negotiations 27 have exchanged official statistics from which it is clearly seen that there is no superiority or disproportion. Both the West and the Warsaw Treaty countries maintain approximately equal numerical strength in Central Europe, something like 980,000 odd men on each side. Obviously, this equilibrium is not completely identical, the armed forces of each side are structured in their own way. With us, say, the ground troops are the chief missile carriers, while in the NATO bloc the Air Force is the main carrier of missiles with nuclear warheads, and so on. It should be added that Western politicians and top-ranking military often repeat the claim that in their opinion Western armaments are of superior quality. So where is the logic in the claim by these same quarters of the imaginary threat from the East? By and large, there is a doubtless military equilibrium in Europe, where the principal forces of the two military and political groups confront each other at closest range. The question is whether this equilibrium should be maintained at the present high level or whether it is possible to lower this level without upsetting the equilibrium in anyone's favor. We in the Soviet Union are firmly convinced that this level can and must be lowered. As for the global balance of forces between the biggest powers, the participants in the two politico-military groupings, that is, the Soviet Union and the United States, an approximate parity, i.e., an equilibrium of strategic forces, has evolved and is being maintained, as both sides have officially acknowledged. This parity underlies the 1972 Soviet-American Agreement on limiting strategic offensive arms, as it also underlies the one that is now in preparation. I can add to this that the total numerical strength of the Soviet armed forces is no military threat to the West, although it is quite enough, if necessary, to deal a retaliatory strike against an aggressor whether in the West or the East. By the way, objective observers, including those in the US press, are very well aware of this and admit it. And now about our Navy. First, I would like to remind you of a simple fact: the Soviet Union's sea frontiers are more than 40,000 kilometers long. And since the NATO countries have powerful offensive weapons at sea, we too have to think about appropriate defense in this sphere. We have built an ocean navy that can meet the tasks of this defense. It is not superior to that of the Western countries in fighting capacity, and is structurally obviously defensive. It is no accident, for instance, that we do not have, and are not building, attack aircraft carriers. Another pet topic of those who enjoy holding forth about the Soviet military threat is the civil defense measures taken in the USSR. It sounds incredible, but it is a fact that specialists in anti-Soviet slander manage to interpret even these measures, aimed at ensuring the safety of the civilian population in the event of war, as a sign of aggressiveness, intimating that the USSR is preparing to deal the first strike while hoping to take cover from retaliation in shelters. It really takes a pathologically distorted imagination to turn things upside down to such an extent. Do any normal people really believe such inventions? We do not want war, and we are not preparing for war. But the Soviet people know from bitter experience what enormous losses to the population an aggressor's actions can cause. And too often have we heard claims of the other side about its readiness to deal powerful, destructive, preemptive strikes, etc., for us to take no measures of defense. Only out-and-out slanderers can interpret this as preparations for attacking anyone. The callous quantitative approach popular in some other countries to the prospects of nuclear war, an approach according to which a certain percentage of civilian casualties is declared tolerable, is alien to us. We are not overjoyed at the predictions one hears in the West that a nuclear war would kill only 10% of the world population and that this is not so terrible, not the end of the world. We do not want anyone, no person on earth, to be among those 10%. The Soviet Union, I repeat, does not think in terms of any first strike. On the contrary, it is well known that we made an official proposal to all those who took part in the European Conference, including the USA, to sign an agreement on not using nuclear weapons against each other first. It is also known that the NATO countries rejected this proposal, giving to understand 29. Rather transparently that they did not wish to abandon plans of a first strike against our country. So who is threatening whom? That is how things really stand. Let us now deal with the political side of the question. The Soviet Union is truly a mighty state, it is powerful politically, economically, and militarily. But it is a peaceful state. Its love of peace stems from the very nature of our society, whose supreme goal, proclaimed by laws and by decisions at the highest political levels, is to ensure the steady growth of the people's material well-being and culture. We have no tasks that we intend to carry out by military means. There is no state against which we have made territorial or any other claims that could result in a military clash. Besides, the Soviet people, the Soviet leaders included, know very well and remember from their own experience what war is like in our time. People of the older generation living in the Federal Republic of Germany also have an idea of what it is like, and perhaps they understand better than, let us say, people in the United States, the ardent wish of the Soviet people to live in peace. Attributing sinister intentions to the Soviet Union because of its military capability is the main argument in Western discourses on the overused topic of a Soviet war threat. One example of this card shuffling is the speculation about how many hours it would take the Soviet army to reach the English Channel. But the Soviet Union has no intentions of attacking any country, either west or east, north or south. The Soviet Union has no intentions whatsoever of conquering Western Europe. And our General Staff is not engaged in working out a timetable for reaching the English Channel. The scale of any Soviet military buildup is determined by the limits of necessary defense. And when assessing Soviet defense needs, we should also remember our country's geographical position. The true intentions of the Soviet Union are clearly stated in official party and state documents. One can also judge them by the entire moral and political atmosphere in which Soviet people live and are brought up. There is no propaganda of militarization, no calls to prepare for war, no fanning of mistrust and hostility towards other nations. They are alien to this atmosphere. The history of the Soviet state provides many examples of its 30. Love of peace. It speaks eloquently of the real causes and sources of the war danger. It also speaks of why we have to give serious attention to problems of defense. When, days after the October Revolution, our state called on all the belligerent powers to conclude peace, the Western countries responded with a collective hostile intervention. When in the 30s the USSR spoke from a high international rostrum in favor of collective security in Europe, the answer was the Munich Agreement and the ensuing Hitler aggression. When the aggressor had been routed and the USSR began to rebuild its war-ravaged economy, the West launched a Cold War against us and blackmailed us with atomic weapons, evidently expecting the USSR, weakened by the war, to obey outside dictation. And when now the USSR makes practical, realistic, and far-reaching proposals for curbing the arms race, and for disarmament, neutron weapons are being brandished in reply. By the way, anyone who knows post-war history will easily remember that the arms race developed according to the principle of action-counteraction. The West issued the challenge and the Soviet Union had to accept it. It has been this way throughout from the first A-bomb to today. And the beginning of each new spurt in the arms race is invariably accompanied by a new howl about a Soviet threat. I would like the esteemed readers of your newspaper to remember one other thing. Not we but the United States of America has dozens of military bases, with bombers and submarines carrying nuclear and other long-range weapons, stretching in an ominous chain along the boundaries of the USSR and of our allies in the south and north, west and east. I would like to propose that those who today spread far-fetched dismay and hysteria about the natural Soviet defense measures, as well as those who believe the panic mongers, should put themselves, if only for a short time, in the place of the Soviet people. These bases have been surrounding our country for several decades. It would be interesting to know what these nervous gentlemen would feel in a similar situation. But the Soviet people have strong nerves. They will never panic, as they have never done before. But they are taking the necessary measures to defend the country from the existing threat. 31. And are carrying on a persevering and consistent struggle for lasting peace and for lowering the level of military confrontation, and this first of all in Europe. Frankly speaking, it seems to me that those in the West who are busy fanning the groundless campaign over a Soviet war threat really have other things in mind. They do not want to accept the approximate equilibrium that has evolved between the military forces of the two sides. What they want is superiority. And that is dangerous, because it gives impetus to a new and unbridled race in arms production and is fraught with military ventures. But it is time these people should finally realize one thing: the Soviet Union has always found an answer to any military challenge and, you may rest assured, will also find an appropriate answer in the future. From the speech at the presentation of an Order of Lenin and a Gold Star to the hero city of Minsk, June 25, 1978. In New York, the UN General Assembly's special session on disarmament is about to close. It has reaffirmed the profound interest of all humanity in stopping the arms race. The vast majority of UN members have spoken in favor of disarmament. The Soviet Union and other socialist countries have come forward at the session with an audacious but feasible program, providing for the complete ending of the arms race. Their proposals were at the center of the General Assembly discussions. The session also showed that leaders of a number of NATO countries, notably the USA, are obviously reluctant to approach disarmament constructively. How else are we to judge the holding of the NATO Council session in Washington, which adopted a new long-term arms program, at a time when in New York the special UN General Assembly session was discussing the very opposite, namely, how to bridle the arms race and how to launch disarmament? If anything, this is total disregard of the concerns and aspirations of the peace-loving nations. Here's what it 32 amounts to. In Washington the NATO countries make realpolitik, while in New York they take part in discussions for appearance's sake, to avoid legitimate criticism and condemnation. The Peking rulers are acting in unison with this posture. It looks as though their representative has confused the speaker's rostrums. His warlike speech is far more appropriate for the NATO session than the UN. I might add that Peking's line has won Washington's complete approval. Of late, attempts have been made in the United States, and this at high level and in fairly cynical terms, to play the China card against the USSR. A short-sighted and dangerous policy. One day its authors may rue it bitterly. The General Assembly is running to a close. But the ideas and proposals aired there will doubtless live and exercise influence. The struggle for palpable deeds in the field of bridling the arms race and in disarmament continues and has got to be stepped up. One of the crucial elements here are the Vienna talks on limiting armed forces and armaments in Central Europe. I have referred to this topic time and again and, I must confess, I did so with a heavy heart. We've come to the 15th round of the talks. They have been going on for nearly 5 years, but so far there have been no practical results. Yet it is no paltry matter, it is of the utmost importance for Europe, and for the entire international situation. Having given the prevailing circumstances close thought, the socialist countries agreed to a new, important step in order to break the impasse at the Vienna talks. Our countries have made far-reaching, concrete proposals in Vienna with consideration for the substantial experience gathered there. What is the main thing about them? First, the proposals are unequivocally clear and precise. They name the concrete figures for Soviet and American troops subject to withdrawal in the first stage. And the figures are impressive. The Soviet Union, for example, is prepared to withdraw 3 divisions with the pertinent weaponry, including something like 1,000 tanks, in the course of a year. Second, the reduction of the NATO and Warsaw Treaty countries' armed forces is to proceed in a way that will not upset their balance or, as we now say, their parity. As a result of the 323-1033 reduction of the troops of all countries, the same common ceiling is to be established for each of the groupings in Central Europe. The idea of such a ceiling, by the way, is consistent with what the Western countries suggested earlier. Though we naturally and firmly believe that none of the participants in the talks should hide behind the backs of others and evade the reduction, much less increase armaments at the expense of reductions by other countries. The socialist countries offer their counterparts a sensible and realistic compromise. By making their proposals they have gone more than halfway to meet the other side. We address ourselves to the NATO countries, let's at last get down to business. There is no denying that the basis for an agreement is on hand. Now everything depends on the West's political intentions. Accords in Vienna would lay the ground for subsequent discussions of other concrete issues pertaining to military détente in Europe that the sides may want to tackle. Some replies to questions of Time magazine January 16, 1979. Fabrications about a Soviet threat are nothing new. There was much trumpeting about it in the West when, following October of 1917, Soviet Russia was invaded by some 15 countries, including the United States, in order to strangle the revolution and restore the old order. British Prime Minister Chamberlain expatiated about it when concluding a deal with Hitler in Munich aimed at directing his aggressive intentions against the Soviet Union. The Nazis covered up their rapacious attack on the USSR with cries about a Soviet threat. It was also invoked by those who set up the NATO military bloc spearheaded against the Soviet Union, which lost 20 million people in the struggle against the aggressor. The same pretext was used when Washington proclaimed a policy of brinkmanship directed against us. And again today, when détente has become fairly tangible on the European continent, when the European Conference in 34. Helsinki has charted paths towards broader peaceful cooperation, and when talks are underway in Vienna to reduce the level of military confrontation, there is a hullabaloo about the Soviet military threat to Western Europe. Apparently, some in the West have found it very difficult to stomach both political détente and especially the intention to reinforce it by lessening the concentration of the military forces of the two sides in the center of Europe. It so happened historically that large numbers of troops and armaments of the two military political blocs are concentrated there facing each other. Different in their structures, in sum total the forces of either side approximately equal each other. Such a military balance has existed in Europe for several decades now. But a huge concentration of armies and armaments is dangerous in itself. Peaceful ties will be far easier to build if this concentration is reduced on both sides without upsetting the existing balance of forces. This is precisely what we are seeking to achieve in Vienna. Yet, we are being told in reply that a reduction is possible only if the USSR and other members of the Warsaw Treaty cut down their forces by a significantly greater degree than the NATO countries. Otherwise, there will allegedly be a Soviet military threat. And it is to the tune of these incessantly repeated allegations that military budgets are frantically growing and NATO forces in Europe are built up. What has happened? Why has the balance that existed for many years suddenly become a threat? And come to think of it, whom are we threatening? Are we really claiming a single square kilometer of the territory of any state? Does not the USSR have normal and even good peaceful relations with practically all countries of Western Europe? Is not the Soviet Union a major sponsor of, an active participant in, all actions to strengthen peace and develop peaceful cooperation in Europe? Why then mislead people, scaring them with the Soviet military threat? I should like to emphasize once again what I have repeatedly said of late: we are not seeking military superiority over the West. We do not need it. All we need is reliable security. And 3*35. The security of both sides will no doubt be greater with the arms race curbed, war preparations curtailed, and the political climate of international intercourse made healthier. From a speech before the electorate of Moscow's Bauman electoral district March 2, 1979. The years that have elapsed since the time of the last elections to the Supreme Soviet of the USSR have been a period of big and complicated events on the world scene. They have been years of the further successful development of the socialist countries, of new victories of the peoples of Africa, Asia, and Latin America in their struggle for national and social emancipation, of a considerable enlivening of class battles of the working people in the capitalist countries, and of a strengthening of the influence of the Communist and Workers' parties there. But it has also been a time when the most reactionary forces of imperialism, arms manufacturers and militarists, Cold War zealots and their hired or self-appointed yes-men united in a wide campaign against détente and disarmament, and against the liberation struggle. On the plea of a spurious Soviet threat, they demand more billions for military purposes, for the making of ever more destructive and barbarous types of weapons. They are trying to crush the national liberation movement with force and to meddle in the domestic affairs of other countries. The position of the Chinese leaders increasingly converges with this policy of imperialism. By their unprecedentedly brazen, bandit-like attack on a small neighboring country, socialist Vietnam, the present Peking rulers have let the whole world see the perfidious and aggressive essence of their great power hegemonistic policy. It is clear to everyone today that precisely this policy now poses the most serious threat to world peace. The full danger of any form of complicity with this policy is clearer now than ever before. In this situation, comrades, the Central Committee of our party and the Soviet government are doing everything to promote cooperation with the forces of peace, freedom, and progress, to frustrate the designs of circles that support aggression, to uphold and deepen international détente, and to reliably ensure that the Soviet people, our allies and friends, can continue to live and work in the conditions of peace. Looking back on the results of the past years, we can say with satisfaction, major successes have been scored in practically all the areas of foreign policy envisaged in the historic documents of the 24th and 25th Congresses of the Soviet Communist Party. One of the main features of our era is the confident and dynamic development of the socialist world and the steady growth of its benign influence on international affairs. The reunification of Vietnam, the socialist revolution in Laos, and the victory of forces of socialism and democracy in Kampuchea have made the socialist world still larger, stronger, and more diverse. We devote particular attention to relations with the fraternal countries. They are becoming increasingly closer and diversified. Studying and assimilating one another's experience, the countries of the socialist community have made major new advances in these years in the construction of their states and in developing socialist democracy. Ending the arms race and averting the danger of a nuclear world war has become the most imperative and pressing task for mankind in our time. The Soviet Union, like the other socialist countries, spares no effort in working for these aims. The collective initiatives of our countries, aimed at strengthening peace, have acquired tremendous significance in present-day international affairs. This also applies, in particular, to the declaration adopted by the Political Consultative Committee of the Warsaw Treaty Organization at its recent conference in Moscow, which contains a number of major new ideas for improving the international climate and launching disarmament. We do not, of course, underestimate the difficulties of strengthening peace and the security of nations. The most urgent task today is to spread détente to the military field. This is all the more important, because the NATO bloc is frantically building up armaments and thus complicating the situation in Europe. What we want is to reach agreement on practical measures to 37. Lower the level of the military confrontation on the continent. This would strengthen the foundations of European peace. Unfortunately, no progress has yet been made here. More and more reports have been appearing of late that the Pentagon is putting pressure on the FRG to allow the United States to deploy in that country in addition to its other theater weapons medium-range nuclear missiles trained on the Soviet Union. There appear to be protests in the FRG against this. Such anxiety is understandable, since implementing these plans, like the designs of the US military concerning the neutron bomb, would only aggravate tension in Europe, trigger a new spiral of the arms race, and greatly increase the danger for the FRG. The Soviet Union has repeatedly said that it wants a limitation of nuclear missile and other weapons by agreements based on full reciprocity, rather than their build-up. The same also concerns medium-range weapons in Europe, taking into account the presence of American military bases there, of course. The joint position of the Soviet Union and the other fraternal socialist countries on this score was recently reaffirmed in the Moscow Declaration of the Warsaw Treaty member countries. From the speech of L. I. Brezhnev at a dinner given in his honor by J. Carter at the U.S. Embassy in Vienna June 16, 1979. The foes of mutual understanding between the USSR and the USA make active use of the myth of the so-called Soviet military threat. Strange as it may seem, the greater the Soviet Union's contribution to the development of peaceful relations among states, the more resolute its sponsorship of concrete proposals to limit armaments and lessen the threat of another war, the more persistent is the spreading of fables concerning our policies. 33. From a release on the reception given by L. I. Brezhnev for the Disarmament Study Group of the Socialist International I. October 1979. Referring to the speculation of imperialist propaganda over a so-called Soviet threat, the General Secretary of the CCCPSU said it was a lie used as a smokescreen by the initiators of the arms race, notably those who are at present pushing plans that would turn Western Europe into a launching site for American weaponry trained on the USSR. These forces are playing with fire. The Soviet Union, Brezhnev said, threatens no one, and has no intention of attacking anyone. From its leaders down to any worker or peasant, the Soviet Union sincerely and wholeheartedly strives for lasting peace. When building its defenses, it does nothing in excess of what is absolutely necessary to ensure its own security and that of its allies. The Soviet Union is persistently proposing that the armaments and armed forces of the Warsaw Treaty and NATO should be reduced. We have submitted dozens of proposals to that effect. Unfortunately, Brezhnev said, our Western partners resort to all sorts of excuses to avoid real disarmament accords. That, in fact, is the only reason why the arms race continues. From the speech of L. I. Brezhnev on the 30th anniversary of the German Democratic Republic Berlin, October 6, 1979. The European Conference adopted the final act, a kind of charter of security for the peoples of Europe, a charter of a peaceful life and of peaceful relations between states. It is our earnest wish that this charter be carried out in full. Judging by their words, Western statesmen want the same. Unfortunately, the deeds of our partners are too often headed in 39. A different direction. We can't help seeing the facts. Supporters of the arms race use all pretexts, even non-existent and far-fetched ones, to stoke up the situation and accelerate military preparations. In Europe they are planning to plant a mine under the very foundation of the edifice of peace. The dangerous plans for the deployment of new types of U.S. nuclear missiles in Western Europe give cause for serious concern. To put it bluntly, implementation of these designs would substantially change the strategic situation on the continent. Their aim is to upset the balance of forces that has taken shape in Europe and to try and win military superiority for the NATO bloc. As far as military superiority is concerned, they have another guess coming. The socialist countries will not, of course, look on impassively while the NATO militarists make their bid. In that event we would have to take the requisite steps to strengthen our security. We would have no other choice. One thing is absolutely clear, any realization of NATO's plans would inevitably aggravate the situation in Europe and in many respects also the international atmosphere. It is no secret that West Germany, too, alongside the USA, has been assigned no small part in the preparation of these dangerous plans. Frankly speaking, those who shape the policy of that country today face a very serious choice. They will have to decide which is best for West Germany, either to help strengthen peace in Europe and develop peaceful, mutually beneficial cooperation among European states in the spirit of good neighborliness and growing mutual confidence, or to contribute to a new aggravation of the situation in Europe and the world by deploying in its territory U.S. nuclear missiles trained on the USSR and its allies. In the latter case the position of West Germany itself would clearly deteriorate considerably. It is not hard to see the consequences for West Germany if the new weapons are put to use by their owners one day. The above also applies, of course, to other European NATO countries that are lucky enough to have U.S. medium-range nuclear missiles deployed in their territory. 40. I repeat again and again that the Soviet Union seeks no military superiority. It is not our intention, and never has been, to threaten any state or group of states. Our strategic doctrine is purely defensive. The assertions that the Soviet Union is building up its military power on the European continent in excess of its defense needs have nothing in common with reality. They are a deliberate deception of the public. In Europe, just as in all other parts of the world, we want peace, lasting peace. This is the fundamental basis of our foreign policy, its backbone. We are pursuing this policy consistently and undeviatingly. As chairman of the Defense Council of the USSR, I can state most definitely that the number of medium-range carriers of nuclear arms in the European part of the Soviet Union has not increased by a single missile or plane in the past 10 years. On the contrary, the number of launchers of medium-range missiles and also the yield of their nuclear warheads have even been slightly decreased. The number of medium-range bombers, too, has gone down. And the Soviet Union has no such weapons in the territory of other states. For a number of years now we have not increased the number of our troops stationed in Central Europe either. I will say more. We are prepared to reduce the number of medium-range nuclear weapons deployed in the west of the Soviet Union from their present level, but only, of course, if no additional medium-range nuclear weapons are deployed in Western Europe. I also want to solemnly confirm the pledge that the Soviet Union will never use nuclear arms against states that have renounced the production and acquisition of such arms and have none in their territory. Motivated by a sincere desire to break the impasse in the long efforts to achieve military détente in Europe, to set an example of transition from ideas to real deeds, we have decided, by agreement with the leadership of the GDR and after consultations with other member states of the Warsaw Treaty, to unilaterally reduce the number of Soviet troops in Central Europe. Up to 20,000 Soviet servicemen, 1,000 tanks and also a certain amount of other weaponry will be withdrawn from the territory. 41. Of the German Democratic Republic in the course of the next 12 months. We are convinced that this new concrete manifestation of the peaceful intentions and goodwill of the Soviet Union and its allies will be welcomed by the peoples of Europe and the rest of the world. We call on the governments of the NATO countries to properly assess the initiatives of socialist states and to follow our good example. The Soviet Union favors further confidence-building measures in Europe. In particular, we are prepared to agree to prior notification of large-scale military exercises of ground forces to be made earlier than provided for by the Helsinki Accords, and not starting at level of 25,000 men, as is the case now, but at the lower level of, say, 20,000 men. We are also prepared on a reciprocal basis to hold no military exercises involving more than 40,000 to 50,000 men. It goes without saying that the proposals of the socialist countries concerning notification of large-scale air and naval exercises near the territorial waters of other countries that participated in the European Conference, remain in force. We have yet another suggestion for the West: let us give timely notification not only of military exercises, but also of troop movements numbering more than 20,000 men anywhere in the area defined by the Helsinki Accords. Consideration could also be given to other ideas directed to building confidence between states, and lessening the danger of a war breaking out in Europe. We continue to regard a European political conference as the most suitable place for discussing a broad set of military détente measures in Europe. It is a pressing thing and, one might say, timely, to prepare and convene such a conference. It is common knowledge that important talks are ahead on SALT III. We are for starting them immediately after the entry into force of the SALT II Treaty. In the framework of these talks we are willing to discuss the possibilities for limiting not only intercontinental but also other types of armaments, with due account, of course, for all the related factors and with strict observance of the principle of the equal security of both sides. 42. The USSR, the GDR, and other socialist countries of Europe offer a clear perspective for ensuring a life in genuine conditions of security and peace for the European peoples. The matter rests with the Western states. Their answer will show whether they are prepared to honor the will and vital interests of the peoples of the world. We hope that realism, statesmanship and, finally, simple common sense will prevail. Reply to the question of a Pravda correspondent November 6, 1979. Question. Speaking on the 6th of October in Berlin, you said the Soviet Union is prepared to reduce the number of medium-range nuclear weapons deployed in the western part of the Soviet Union if no additional weapons of the same kind are deployed in Western Europe. How, in your opinion, could the solution of this question be tackled? Answer. Our proposal, made in the Berlin speech, is aimed at securing progress in a whole range of problems of military détente and of arms limitation on the European continent. The initial response to this suggestion shows that it has been correctly understood by all who cherish peace and security in Europe. At the same time, it naturally went against the grain of those who want to intensify the arms race on the European continent, specifically in medium-range nuclear weaponry. As for tackling the question of these weapons in practice, there is only one way to start negotiations. The Soviet Union believes they should be started immediately. We are prepared to do so. It is up to the Western powers. The main thing is, however, that no hasty actions should be taken that could complicate the situation and hinder the achievement of positive results. There would be more chances of obtaining good results if no decisions are taken on the production and deployment in Western Europe of the mentioned weapons before the conclusion of talks. Conversely, the chances would be undermined if such decisions were taken by NATO. Another point is worth mentioning. The Soviet Union and other Warsaw Treaty countries have 43. Offered all countries that participated in the European Conference to renounce first use of both nuclear and non-nuclear weapons against one another. We have not received an answer to this proposal so far. However, I wish to emphasize once more, and this with full responsibility, that the Soviet Union will not use nuclear weapons against any state that renounces manufacture and acquisition of such weapons and has none on its territory. We would be prepared to formalize an appropriate commitment with any interested state. Replies to questions of a Pravda correspondent January 13, 1980. Question: Leonid Ilyich, how do you evaluate the present international situation, particularly in the light of the U.S. administration's latest steps? Answer: the consistent and creative pursuance by our party of the course of peace, détente, and disarmament, and of implementing the peace program of the 24th and 25th Congresses of the CPSU, has made it possible to achieve a great deal. Broadly speaking, the main accomplishment is that we have succeeded in breaking the tragic cycle, World War brief spell of peace World War again. We, the Soviet people, and our friends the peoples of the fraternal socialist countries, all those who have struggled and continue to struggle for peace, for détente, for the peaceful coexistence of states with different social systems are legitimately proud of this historic result. Unfortunately, the situation has deteriorated visibly at the turn of the 80s and the peoples must know the truth about who is responsible for this. I will answer without any reservations: the imperialist forces, and especially certain circles in the United States, are to blame. The blame lies with all those who see in the relaxation of tension an obstacle to their aggressive plans, to whipping up a militaristic psychosis, and to interference in the internal affairs of other peoples. The blame lies with those who have a deeply ingrained habit of behaving in a cavalier manner with other states, of acting in the international arena as if they are free to do anything they wish. 44. It has been clear for some time that governing quarters in the United States and some other NATO countries have set a course that is hostile to détente, a course that is designed to escalate the arms race and that tends to increase the war danger. It began as early as in 1978 at the May session of the NATO Council in Washington, where the automatic growth of the military budgets of NATO member countries till the end of the 20th century was approved. Lately, the militaristic tendencies in U.S. policy also find expression in an acceleration of new long-term arms programs, in the creation of new military bases far away from the United States, including the Middle East and the Indian Ocean area, and in the activation of the so-called Rapid Deployment Force, an instrument of the policy of military interference. Or take such an important document as the SALT II Treaty. Its implementation would have opened the way to major disarmament measures. As we know, this treaty received worldwide support, including that of the United States NATO allies, and the support of broad sections of the world public. But what did the Carter administration do with it? The treaty was barely signed when people in the United States began discrediting it. The opponents of the treaty, not without the connivance of U.S. government circles, began using the ratification procedure to gravely complicate the treaty's coming into force. By his recent decision to defer indefinitely the debate on the SALT II Treaty in the Senate, President Carter added one more touch to this unseemly process. In December 1979, the United States forced on its NATO allies a decision to deploy new medium-range nuclear missiles in a number of West European countries, leading to a new spiral of the arms race. Washington virtually muzzled those of its allies who were inclined to respond positively to the Soviet Union's constructive proposals for holding talks on this matter. Today, the opponents of peace and détente are trying to speculate on the events in Afghanistan. Mountains of lies are being heaped around these events and a shameless anti-Soviet campaign has been mounted. What has really happened in Afghanistan? A revolution took place there in April 1978. The Afghan 45 people took their destiny into their own hands and embarked on the road of independence and freedom. As always in history, the forces of the past rose against the revolution. The people of Afghanistan, of course, could have coped with them on their own. But from the first days of the revolution they encountered external aggression and gross interference from without in the country's internal affairs. Thousands and tens of thousands of insurgents, armed and trained abroad, and whole armed units were sent into Afghanistan. In effect, imperialism and its accomplices launched an undeclared war against revolutionary Afghanistan. Afghanistan firmly demanded that the aggression should be halted and that it should be allowed to build its new life in peace. Resisting the external aggression, the Afghan leadership, during the lifetime of President Tariki and subsequently as well, repeatedly asked the Soviet Union for assistance. We warned those concerned that if the aggression was not stopped, we would not abandon the Afghan people at their time of trial. And it is common knowledge that we stand by what we say. The actions of the aggressors against Afghanistan were facilitated by Amin who, on seizing power, loosened harsh repressive measures against large sections of Afghan society, against party and military cadres, representatives of the intelligentsia, and the Muslim clergy, that is, the very sections that were the base of the April Revolution. Under the leadership of the People's Democratic Party headed by Babrak Karmal, the people rose against the Amin tyranny and put an end to it. Now Amin is being mourned in Washington and some other capitals. This is a conclusive exposure of their hypocrisy. Where were these mourners when Amin was conducting his mass repressions, when he forcibly removed and criminally killed Tariki, the founder of the new Afghan state? The unceasing armed intervention and the far-reaching implications of the conspiracy of external reactionary forces created the real danger that Afghanistan may lose its independence and become an imperialist military bridgehead on our country's southern border. In other words, the time had come when we had to respond to the request of the government of friendly Afghanistan. Not to do so would have meant leaving Afghani. 46. Stand at the mercy of the imperialists, allowing the aggressive forces to repeat in that country what they had done in, say, Chile, where the people's freedom was drowned in blood. Not to do so would have meant looking on passively while a source of serious danger to the security of the Soviet state was created on our southern border. In turning to us, Afghanistan acted on the clear-cut provisions of the Treaty of Friendship, Good Neighborliness and Cooperation concluded by Afghanistan and the USSR in December 1978, and on the right of each state inscribed in the United Nations Charter to individual or collective self-defense, a right that other states have exercised many times. It was no simple decision for us to send Soviet military contingents to Afghanistan. But the Central Committee of the party and the Soviet government acted in full awareness of their responsibility and took into account all the relevant circumstances. The sole task of the Soviet contingents is to assist the Afghans in repulsing the aggression from without. They will be fully withdrawn from Afghanistan once the reasons for the Afghan leadership's request for them drop away. Imperialist and Peking propaganda is deliberately and shamelessly distorting the Soviet Union's role in Afghan affairs. It goes without saying that there is no Soviet intervention or aggression, and never has been. We are helping the new Afghanistan at the request of its government to defend the country's national independence, freedom and honor against armed aggressive actions from without. The national interests of the security of the United States of America and other countries are not in the least affected by the events in Afghanistan. All attempts to portray matters differently are sheer nonsense. They are made with ill intent, with the aim of easing the fulfillment of their own imperialist plans. Also absolutely false are the allegations that the Soviet Union has expansionist plans in respect to Pakistan, Iran, or other countries in that area. The policy and mentality of colonialism is alien to us. We do not covet the land or wealth of others. It is the colonialists who are attracted by the smell of oil. The disquisitions about a Soviet threat to peace and the attempts to pose as guardians of international morality are 47. Obvious and outright hypocrisy on the part of those whose record includes the dirty war in Vietnam, who did not lift a finger when the Chinese aggressors made their armed intrusion into socialist Vietnam, who have for decades maintained a military base on Cuba contrary to the will of the Cuban people and government, who are saber-rattling and threatening to blockade Iran, and who are exerting open military pressure on the revolutionary Iranian people by sending a nuclear-armed naval armada, including a considerable part of the U.S. carrier force, to the shores of Iran. There is one final point that must be made in this connection. Interference in the internal affairs of Afghanistan is really taking place, and even such an august and respected institution as the United Nations organization is being used for this. Indeed, can the discussion of the so-called Afghan question at the United Nations in defiance of the objections of the government of Afghanistan be described as anything but gross disrespect for the sovereign rights of the Afghan state? The fact remains that the Afghan government and its responsible representative in the United Nations organization have declared for all to hear, "Leave us alone." The Soviet military contingents were brought in at our request and in accordance with the Soviet-Afghan Treaty and with Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. Meanwhile, under cover of the hue and cry, assistance is being increased to the elements that intrude into Afghanistan and perpetrate aggressive actions against the legitimate government. Recently the White House openly announced its decision to send these elements more military equipment and everything else needed for hostile activity. The Western press reports that during his talks in Peking the U.S. Secretary of Defense made arrangements with the Chinese leadership to coordinate such actions. Concluding the topic of Afghanistan, it must be said that there is nothing surprising in the hostile reaction of imperialist forces to the events in that country. The crux of the matter is that the card the imperialists and their accomplices had counted on there has been trumped. In short, the events in Afghanistan are not the real cause of the present deterioration of the international climate. If there 48 were no Afghanistan, certain circles in the United States and NA10 would have surely found some other pretext to aggravate the world situation. Finally, the sum total of the U.S. administration's moves in connection with the events in Afghanistan, the freezing of the SALT II Treaty, the refusal to continue deliveries to the USSR of a number of commodities, including grain, under previously concluded contracts, the termination of talks with the Soviet Union on a number of questions of bilateral relations, and so on shows that just as decades ago Washington is trying to speak to us the language of Cold War. Moreover, the Carter administration is showing contempt for important interstate documents, disrupting established ties in the fields of science, culture, and human contacts. It would be difficult even to enumerate all the treaties, intergovernmental agreements, accords and understandings concluded by our two countries on questions of mutual relations in various fields that have been arbitrarily and unilaterally violated in the recent period by President Carter's government. Of course, we will manage without these ties with the United States. In fact, we never sought them as a favor, believing rather that they were mutually advantageous arrangements meeting the interests of the peoples of both our countries, especially in the context of strengthening peace. But the arrogation by Washington of a right to reward or punish independent sovereign states raises an important question of principle. In effect, these U.S. government actions deal a blow at the entire system of relations among states based on international law. As a result of the Carter administration's actions, the United States is increasingly showing itself to the world to be a very unreliable partner in interstate ties, a state whose leadership, prompted by a whim, caprice, or emotional quirk, or by some narrowly understood immediate advantage, is capable at any moment of violating its international obligations and cancelling treaties and agreements it has signed. There is hardly any need to dwell on the dangerous destabilizing impact this has on the entire international situation, the more so since this concerns the behavior of the leadership of a big, influential power from which 423-1049. The peoples are entitled to expect a well-considered and responsible policy. Of course, these actions of the U.S. administration will not inflict on us the damage obviously expected by their initiators. The cynical estimates concerning a deterioration of the food situation in the Soviet Union as a result of the U.S. refusal to sell us grain are based on nonsensical notions about our economic potential. The Soviet people are quite capable of continuing to live and work calmly, to fulfill their plans, to raise their living standards. In particular, I can say that the plans for the provision of the Soviet people with bread and bakery products will not be cut by a single kilogram. We cannot regard the actions of the US administration as anything but a poorly considered attempt at using the events in Afghanistan to block the international efforts of reducing the danger of war, strengthening peace, and limiting the arms race, that is, to block the aims in which mankind is so vitally interested. The unilateral measures taken by the United States are a serious political miscalculation. Like a boomerang, they will strike their initiators, if not today then tomorrow. But if all these sallies against our policy are intended to test us, the initiators have simply forgotten the experience of history. When the world's first socialist state was born in 1917, our people did not ask for anybody's permission. Today, too, they decide for themselves what their way of life is to be. Imperialism tried to put us to the test at the very dawn of Soviet government, and everybody remembers what came of it. The fascist aggressors tried to break us in the bloodiest war ever experienced by mankind. But they suffered defeat. We were subjected to grave trials in the years of the Cold War, when the world was pushed to the brink of the precipice, when one international crisis followed another. But then, too, nobody ever succeeded in shaking our resolve. It is very useful to remember this today. Question: what, in your opinion, is the outlook for the situation in Europe? Answer: the situation in Europe today is much better than it was, say, in the early 70s. But, of course, Washington's latest display of irresponsibility is making itself felt here as well. 50. The United States is not content with doing almost everything possible to poison Soviet-American relations. It would also like to spoil relations between the West European countries and the Soviet Union, relations in which, as we know, many useful things have been achieved during the past decade. The United States is trying to undermine the spirit and essence of the Helsinki Final Act, which has become a recognized milestone in strengthening security and developing peaceful cooperation on the continent. Lastly, Washington's attempts to aggravate the international situation also have the aim of putting pressure on the European states, especially its own allies. But the basic interests of the European peoples are inseparably bound up with détente. The Europeans already know its advantages from their own experience. They live on a continent that was scorched more than once by devastating wars, and we are convinced that they are not at all willing to embark on a road of adventure at the bidding of overseas politicians. It is impossible to believe that there are states in Europe that would wish to throw the fruits of détente under the boots of those ready to trample on them. Western states, including the United States, need détente in Europe no less than do the socialist countries, than does the Soviet Union. Much of a constructive nature can be done to strengthen peace in Europe in the near future, particularly in connection with the forthcoming meeting in Madrid and the Warsaw Treaty countries' proposal for the holding of a conference on military détente and disarmament. We are determined to consolidate and multiply everything positive that has been achieved over the years on the European continent through the collective efforts of states big and small. We will continue to pursue our policy of peace and friendship between peoples. In contrast to Washington's present extremist stance, our position is to continue the talks started in recent years in many directions with the aim of stopping the arms race. This, naturally, also applies to problems of lessening the military confrontation in Europe. I repeat, we are for talks, but for honest and equal talks, for observance of the principle of equal security. And precisely that kind of talks we recently proposed to start on the question of medium-range nuclear arms. Nobody can expect the Soviet 4*51 Union to accept NATO's terms, designed to allow it to conduct talks from positions of strength. The present attitude of the NATO countries makes talks on this problem impossible. We have officially informed the US government to this effect some days ago. We look to the future with optimism. It is a well-founded optimism. We understand that the deliberate aggravation of the international situation by US imperialism is an expression of its displeasure at the consolidation of the positions of socialism, the upsurge of the national liberation movement, the strengthening of the forces working for détente and peace. We know that the will of the peoples has, despite all obstacles, cleared a way for the positive direction termed détente in world affairs. This policy has deep roots. It is supported by powerful forces and has every chance of remaining the basic trend in international relations. Our people, our country are advancing firmly along the road of communist construction, fulfilling the tasks of the 10th Five-Year Plan, pursuing the course charted by the party. The Soviet people and our friends abroad may rest assured that our Leninist foreign policy course will never waver. It was charted in the decisions of CPSU congresses and is now being carried out in every area of our foreign relations and activities. This course combines consistent dedication to peace with firm rebuff to aggression. It has justified itself in the past decades and we will continue to follow it. No one can divert us from this course. From a speech to electors of Moscow's Bauman election district February 22, 1980. The peace policy of the countries of the socialist community, their joint drive for détente and for lessening the danger of a nuclear missile world war, has become one of the leading factors in international affairs. Their struggle is now the main guarantee of humanity's peaceful future. Virtually all the important decisions strengthening peace and bridling the arms race adopted in the past 10 years at international forums, like all the important negotiations on these issues. 52. Were initiated by the socialist countries. Their concrete proposals for disarmament and international cooperation are, cumulatively, a broad, far-sighted and realistic program safeguarding peace in our time. And we shall fight on perseveringly and indefatigably for its implementation. With the imperialist forces mounting a counter-offensive against détente and peace, and against the rights of nations, the socialist countries' unity of action in defense of these supreme values has become more important than ever. And I am sure our countries are doing their best to fulfill their historic mission. Our foreign policy derives its force from the fact that it meets the vital interests of the socialist countries and of the vast majority of people on earth, and above all people that have flung off the colonial yoke and are now engaged in the hard job of building a new, independent life. Quite as much as the socialist countries, they need lasting peace, strict respect for the sovereignty of states and rights of peoples, and truly equitable international relations. This, indeed, is the basis of our good relations and mutually beneficial cooperation with many dozens of countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, be it Great India or Little Benin, Republican Algeria, or monarchist Jordan, neighboring Turkey or faraway Brazil. We value our relations with all these countries, and respect their rights. We covet none of their riches and want no military bases on their territory. We value the closeness of our standpoints on many international issues, but we never try to tell them what policy they should follow. The Soviet Union has made a visible contribution to the economic consolidation, cultural development, and defense capability of some of these countries, and of this we are proud. Faithful to Lenin's behests, we always take the side of peoples defending their freedom and independence. But we never use our aid to pressure those to whom it is rendered. This is what creates the atmosphere of respect and confidence in our relations to the mutual advantage of both sides and to the benefit of world peace. I want especially to mention the successful development of 53. Our good relations with India. They work in the interests of our two peoples, and of peace in Asia and the rest of the world. The understanding reached recently about a joint space flight of Soviet and Indian cosmonauts in the not-distant future may be taken as a symbol of our friendship. We are pleased that Mrs. Indira Gandhi's government has accepted our proposal to this effect. But the consolidation of peace and the successes of the liberation struggle of peoples are distasteful to the warlike imperialist quarters, notably those of U.S. imperialism. Look how they responded to the extension of mutually beneficial contacts between the socialist countries and many capitalist states, how they responded to the success of the European Conference in Helsinki, and how they responded to the victory over imperialist interventionists and mercenaries of the revolutionary peoples of Angola and Ethiopia. It was a peculiar response. They began dragging out the SALT II talks and thereupon the ratification of the treaty. They encouraged the treachery of Sadat, who split the front of Arab unity against aggression. They saddled the NATO countries with a long-term arms program. They froze, and in some cases torpedoed various ongoing negotiations on disarmament. Lastly, they took the inflammatory decision to station new U.S. missiles in Western Europe trained on the Soviet Union and its allies. It has become quite clear that the present U.S. leadership has set a course to disrupting détente and complicating the international situation. It is trying to dictate its will to the socialist states and other countries. Has this been unexpected? Certainly not. It was clear from the beginning that only persevering political struggle can dependably secure peace and détente. Détente meets the interests of the peoples. The need for it is understood by all responsible, realistic politicians. But it is opposed by strong forces in capitalist countries that are directly or indirectly preparing a war, the militarists, the monopolies associated with them, and their protégés in the state apparatus and the mass media. And the more imperialism's ability to lord it over other countries and peoples diminishes, the fiercer is the reaction of its more aggressive and short-sighted supporters. This aggressiveness can 54 be contained only by the power and the sensible policy of the peaceful states, the determination of nations to block the dangerous plans of the claimants to world supremacy. After the United States had imposed its missile plans on West European countries, it turned its attention to Asia and the Middle East, concentrating a large naval force close to the shores of revolutionary Iran ostensibly to save a group of captured diplomats. Thereupon it seized on what it thought a convenient excuse: the events in Afghanistan. The vicious anti-Soviet howl raised over this in America has probably beaten all previous records. This is only an excuse. Mr. Carter and his entourage know perfectly well that there was and is no Russian intervention in Afghanistan. The Soviet Union acted in accordance with the Soviet-Afghan Treaty of Friendship. 3 successive Afghan governments had turned to us with insistent calls for aid against an outside invasion of counter-revolutionary forces. Washington is also fully informed about the intervention against Afghanistan from Pakistani territory. Indeed, the Americans themselves, together with the Chinese and others, are directing this intervention, which has posed a serious threat to the Afghan revolution and, for that matter, to the security of our southern frontiers. The White House also knows that the Soviet Union will withdraw its military contingents from Afghanistan the moment the reasons for their presence there drop away and the Afghan government feels that this presence is no longer necessary. The United States is clamoring for the Soviet troops to withdraw. But, in effect, it is making the withdrawal more remote by continuing and escalating interference in Afghanistan's affairs. I want to make it absolutely clear that we are prepared to begin withdrawing our troops the moment all forms of outside interference against the government and people of Afghanistan will be completely stopped. Let the United States and Afghanistan's neighbors guarantee this, and the need for Soviet military aid will drop away. It is common knowledge that the government of Afghanistan has, for its part, clearly expressed its intention to maintain relations of peace and friendship with 55. its neighbors, in particular Iran and Pakistan. Naturally, we welcome this Afghan approach. The US leaders also know that the government of Afghanistan is showing complete respect for the religious beliefs of the population, that it has released the mullahs imprisoned by Amin, and that it has officially placed Islam under the protection of the law. The attempts of the patrons of Israeli aggression and the organizers of sanctions against Iran to pose as protectors of Islam look more than clumsy. Why did Washington fly into global hysterics? What is behind all the lies about a Russian war against the Afghan people, the Soviet threat to Pakistan and Iran, and so on? The answer is that Washington wants a pretext to extend its expansion in Asia and will stop at nothing to create that pretext. The wave of anti-Soviet hysteria is being whipped up not simply for someone to win the presidential elections this autumn on the crest of this wave. The main motive is that the United States wants to set up a web of military bases in the Indian Ocean, in countries of the Near and Middle East, and in African countries. The United States would like to subject these countries to its hegemony and without hindrance ship out their natural wealth. Besides, it wants to use their territory for its strategic designs against the socialist world and the forces of national liberation. That's what it is all about. But the modern colonialists are taking a risk. The world is not what it was before the war, not even what it was in the 50s. Dozens of formerly dependent countries have gained the experience of independent life and politics. The peoples have learned to see through the imperialist game and to distinguish friends from foes. In such regions as, say, Western Europe or Japan, too, people have learned from experience the advantages of tranquil, peaceful life and profitable trade. They will not easily give up détente to suit the American plans of world supremacy. And we stand as before for broader peaceful cooperation all down the line with these countries and, for that matter, also with the United States. People in Washington like to refer to the need for maintaining the security of the oil routes to the United States. That, in a way, we can understand. But can this be done by turning the 56 communications zone into a powder keg? Clearly, the result can only be negative. The adventurous doctrines of the new advocates of the positions of strength policy endanger not merely some separate country or group of countries, but also the peace and security of all states and peoples. All those who need and cherish peace must therefore repulse these sinister designs. Nobody will ever succeed in intimidating the Soviet Union. Our strength and resources are tremendous. We and our allies will always be able to stand for ourselves and ward off any hostile thrust. Nor will anyone ever succeed in provoking us. We oppose the doctrine of war hysteria and frantic arming with our doctrine of consistent struggle for world peace and security. We are faithful to the peace program put forward by the 24th and 25th Congresses of our party. This is why now, in the 80s, just as in the 70s, we stand for strengthening, not destroying, détente. We stand for reducing, not increasing armaments. We stand for closer relations and mutual understanding among nations, not for artificial alienation and hostility. We confidently hold up the banner of our foreign policy, a banner of peace, of the freedom and independence of peoples, a banner of social progress. Press conference in Bonn. By A. A. Gromyko, member of the CCCPSU Politburo and USSR Minister of Foreign Affairs. A. A. Gromyko, member of the Politburo of the CPSU Central Committee and Minister of Foreign Affairs of the USSR, held a press conference in Bonn on November 23, 1979, which he opened with the following statement: "We have arrived in the Federal Republic of Germany on an official visit for an exchange of opinion with FRG statesmen on a number of important issues both of Soviet-West German relations and international politics. Perhaps it would be right to emphasize that special attention was given in the course of the conversations held here to the situation in Europe, in other words, to the issues of European security. We have had meetings and conversations as well as negotiations with, first of all, Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, President K. Carstens and Minister for Foreign Affairs Hans-Dietrich Genscher. During an exchange of views on matters related to the bilateral Soviet-West German relations, both sides reaffirmed that they had covered much ground in the development of these relations. Both sides agreed that the 1970 Moscow Treaty between the USSR and the FRG, as well as other joint Soviet-West German documents, principally those adopted at summit meetings, have played and continue to play an immense role in this sense. Both sides said that there had been great headway both in the field of political relations and in that of economic and trading links, as well as in cultural relations, scientific and technological cooperation and in some other areas. It was pointed out in the course of these discussions that there are certain shortcomings, notably in the field of economic and trading contacts. But the general mood on both sides is optimistic in the 58 sense that these shortcomings can be removed. The Soviet Union, for its part, will do everything possible to remove them. It was suggested by both sides during the discussion of world affairs and the international situation that the only right policy is that of easing international tensions, the policy of strengthening peace, the policy of seeking agreement on disarmament and accords to contain the arms race. The issues related to Europe were discussed to the fullest possible extent. On behalf of the Soviet leadership and L.I. Brezhnev personally, I made a statement that we have taken a positive view of the declarations of Chancellor Schmidt and other statesmen of the Federal Republic of Germany about the commitment of the FRG to the policy of détente. We have likewise declared that we have always reacted in a positive way to statements by the FRG government leaders, and notably Chancellor Schmidt, on matters related to the ending of the arms race, his statements in favor of a search of agreements on limiting strategic offensive arms and disarmament accords in general. We, I repeat, have taken a positive view of such declarations and believed that the FRG is making a definite contribution to the general effort for détente and peace. Further, we have noted the positive stand of the FRG and its coalition government with respect to the Soviet-American Treaty on the Limitation of Strategic Offensive Arms. The FRG is known to have spoken in favor of its ratification or, in other words, for its entry into force. This is a good stand. It appeals to us, and to all friends of détente and of ending the arms race. Now, to put it bluntly, I am coming to the most dramatic and delicate issue on which the FRG and the Soviet Union have found no common ground. Those present here today know well that certain NATO quarters produced some plans recently for the deployment of new types of medium-range nuclear missiles and missiles in Western Europe. I think it is no mistake to say that the impulses must have come from the Pentagon or some quarters close to it. If, however, anybody proves that these impulses have come from some other sources and produces convincing arguments to show it, we will accept them. But it doesn't even matter what quarters generated these impulses, that is, produced them first. What matters is the stand each particular 59 side takes on this issue. What is of much interest to us in this particular case, and we make no secret of it, is the position taken by the Federal Republic of Germany. Unfortunately, we have to note that the FRG government, as our negotiations here in Bonn made clear, has reacted affirmatively to these plans. We have done everything we could to show, with an array of appropriate arguments, that the deployment of such weapons is not the way to promote détente or improve the situation in Europe. On the contrary, it is a way of exacerbating the situation in Europe, a way of spurring the arms race. It is the opening of yet another stage, yet another round, in the arms race. And what is more, it involves missiles and nuclear weapons, not toys. You know that the most exhaustive exposition of our views on this score was given by L.I. Brezhnev in his recent speech in Berlin, which contained an evaluation of these plans and of the position of the NATO governments supporting them, including that of the FRG. What have we been told in reply to our statements criticizing these plans and the position taken by the FRG? We have been told that it is a reaction to the Soviet Union's deployment of certain weapons on its own territory. The reference was to the missile installations called SS-20 in the West. But what kind of installations are they? They are virtually modernized models of existing types of missile installations. We were asked, but what is this modernization for? The NATO countries have also repeatedly modernized their armaments, including certain similar types of weapons. The retort we got was that this happened a long time ago, while you, they said, have been doing it recently. But, one may ask, is it better or worse that the Western nations carried out the modernization earlier than the Soviet Union? Perhaps we, too, ought to have done so earlier. The impression one may get is that some Western quarters, with a telescope or a microscope in hand, or who knows what, have suddenly discovered what the Soviet Union was doing. In fact, however, the Soviet Union has been modernizing some of its armaments for at least 5 years, and has made no secret of it. It has done nothing new in the last year, 2, 3 or 4, it merely continued the modernization it had once started. 60. On the assumption that there are some misguided people who sincerely believe that the Soviet Union may gain an unwarranted advantage in this respect, we have declared, well, if anybody has doubts, let us begin negotiations. Let us sit down at the negotiating table. We also said that we are even willing to consider reducing our missile launchers, that is cutting their present number. I ask you to pay attention to this and to remember cutting their number. In the course of these negotiations each country would be free to make its own proposals. Why is it unacceptable to the NATO countries, including the Federal Republic of Germany, and, indeed, to the United States of America? Why? It is common knowledge that L.I. Brezhnev made this proposal in his Berlin speech for the first time. Later, he repeated the negotiations offer in his reply to a question by a Pravda correspondent. I have reaffirmed our proposal here in Bonn. And we have been told in reply that the FRG government is in favor of negotiations. On hearing this, I and my comrades present at the conversations, were ready to leap for joy. There we were, moving closer together, we suggest negotiations and negotiations are being suggested to us. But we did well to refrain from jumping, for there followed a clarification which showed that the negotiations we proposed and the negotiations that were being proposed to us were of an entirely different kind. We have proposed immediate negotiations with the situation unchanged, that is without any decisions being taken to deploy any new types of nuclear missiles in Western Europe, and without setting in motion the machinery of manufacturing and deploying them. But we have been told, no, first we are going to take the decision about making these weapons and deploying them, and only afterwards we will start negotiating with you. Some of the NATO governments, and you know them very well, say in so many words that they have to negotiate with the Soviet Union from positions of strength. If I may say so, these statements smell of political mothballs. We have said openly that putting the matter in these terms is tantamount to laying down a preliminary political condition. This destroys the basis for negotiations. I repeat, this position of certain NATO countries is destroying the basis for negotiations. 61. If anybody tries to prove that this is not so, that, in fact, there is no difference between our proposal to negotiate and the one I have referred to, don't believe him. These are different concepts of negotiation. Let every citizen of the NATO countries, let every German of the Federal Republic of Germany, coolly consider all the pros and cons of our proposal about immediate negotiations. Let him judge for himself what is better, to blindly follow those who advocate a decision to make and deploy new types of nuclear weapons, or to negotiate with the Soviet Union at once and try to find an agreed solution suiting both sides. Negotiations are meant to consider everything, and to discuss everything, and to try and work out an agreed, mutually acceptable solution. Neither side can impose a solution that is unacceptable to the other side. What, I repeat, is wrong about the negotiations we are proposing? To set their minds at rest, some people say that the Soviet Union and the United States have already come to terms that the SALT III talks would also cover issues related to other weapons, to non-strategic ones. Let's suppose this could be done, though the understanding between the US and the Soviet Union does not provide for it. It concerns nothing but strategic types of weapons. But, I repeat, suppose everybody agrees to this? Do you remember how long the SALT II negotiations have taken? About 8 years. Now suppose the SALT III negotiations involve not only strategic arms, but also medium-range nuclear missiles. How long, do you think, they could take? We'd be lucky if they took 7 or 8 years. But isn't there an immense danger lurking here for Europe and, indeed, not Europe alone? There would be negotiations, but no solution. Isn't that so? What we are proposing, on the other hand, is immediate negotiations, without waiting for SALT III. Besides, there is one more important aspect of the matter that requires some clarification, because I am not sure that members of the press present in this room are keeping it in their field of vision. What I mean is the principle of equality and equal security. When L.I. Brezhnev and President Carter met in Vienna and signed the SALT II treaty, both expressed their satisfaction that the negotiations had been governed by this particular principle. And, in general, how many statements were made to the effect that 62. There was rough parity between the forces of East and West. Now, all of a sudden, representatives of Western countries, including those of the US, maintain that there is no such parity and that it will not be achieved until after NATO's plans have been carried out. So we ask, when did the American president present the true US position? Today or in Vienna? One conflicts with the other. In fact, it is the deployment of new nuclear weapons and missiles in Western Europe that would upset the balance of forces which NATO leaders have acknowledged dozens of times in the past. And, finally, the last question concerning this problem. Sometimes, they say, very well, we could discuss all this when drafting SALT III. But, do you know, by the way, that no agreement has been reached so far on what countries will participate in the SALT III negotiations? Some people may say, certainly, the Soviet Union and the United States. But is it only the United States and the Soviet Union? Other countries, too, have strategic weapons. Between what and between which countries should there be parity? Why should the Soviet Union always take it for granted that the matter concerns parity only between the United States and itself? What about the US allies that possess nuclear weapons? That, too, is a legitimate question. And all that has not been settled yet. Hence, it is quite impossible to begin the SALT III negotiations soon. To say nothing of the fact that SALT II has not yet come into force, and nobody knows when it will. And, besides, has any one of you, or anybody else, ever asked what parity means if the US has bases and so-called nuclear forward-based forces in Europe? In terms of SALT, parity should be understood to mean an established numerical and qualitative equivalence. This was the approach to drafting SALT II. But the American forward-based nuclear weapons in Europe were not taken into account. And what about the geographical factor? It does not fit into either the numerical or the qualitative characteristics of strategic weapons per se. Yet, that is a factor working exclusively in favor of the United States. During the drafting of the SALT II treaty we attempted, and this also at the Brezhnev-Ford meeting in Vladivostok, to discuss the question of the US forward-based weapons. The American side, however, resolutely 63. Refused to do so. Putting it bluntly, the Soviet Union made a concession by agreeing that the treaty need not take the geographical factor into account, though it is advantageous for the West, for the USA. The Soviet Union has nothing that would counterbalance this factor. That, too, has got to be taken into consideration. Thereupon, A. Gromyko answered the questions of journalists. Question: You have referred to a radical difference in the estimates given by the sides of their own military potentials, and to the consequent distinction between their positions. What could be the subject of the talks in this case, and would the question of nuclear weapons stand at the center? Answer: Yes, of course. The talks must deal with the question of nuclear weapons, but without any preliminary decision on manufacturing and stationing new types of weapons in Western Europe. There must be no decision of that sort. If an agreement acceptable to all sides is reached at the talks, that issue will, after all, drop away by itself. Question: In your talks with Mr. Genscher, the Federal Minister of Foreign Affairs, the West German side expressed concern over the situation in the Middle East and urged solidarity with the United States. My question: What do you think of the situation in Iran, and is the Soviet Union prepared for solidarity with the United States to eliminate the difficulties there? Answer: Briefly about our standpoint. We stand for the fulfillment of the pertinent international convention on respecting diplomatic immunity. That was the position we took when the matter was discussed in the Security Council, and it is known by the government of the United States and the government of Iran. And I hope a solution to the issue is found to the mutual satisfaction of all concerned. But the sides, and this includes the United States, must show restraint and composure, and must not let their emotions run over. Question: What with the tremendous material for conflict that has accumulated between the USSR and the USA, we Europeans ask ourselves, if now, 35 years after the past war, it is really necessary to maintain such horrible stockpiles of arms? 64. Answer: This is something that concerns other countries as well as the United States. We have repeatedly offered the United States and other countries to limit armaments to a far greater extent than this is envisaged in SALT I, SALT II, and other pertinent agreements. We have made proposals for radical disarmament under appropriate international control. It is even hard to enumerate the number of such proposals. Unfortunately, they were systematically turned down by the United States and its NATO allies. This, however, will not deter us from making these proposals. We will always be faithful to our course. For us it has been a vital policy ever since Lenin's time. Question: Do you think negotiations are possible if the coming NATO session decides on upgrading armaments? Answer: the present position of the NATO countries, including that of the Federal Republic of Germany as it looks now, is going to destroy the basis for negotiations. We have said so to the government of the FRG. Question: during your visit to Spain you expressed yourself against its entering NATO. But Spain has a military treaty with the United States, and American bases on its territory. What difference will it make if Spain is inside or outside NATO? Why do you qualify this as a change of quality? Answer: as we see it, Spain will gain still more political capital, a still greater political potential, if it continues to follow an independent, I repeat independent policy. Question: do you mean that if the coming NATO session takes the above-mentioned decision, the Soviet Union will not be prepared to negotiate Euro-strategic weapons? Answer: let me repeat, if the decision is taken and our proposal for starting negotiations is turned down, this posture of the Western powers will destroy the basis for negotiations. There will be no such basis. If this situation arises, it will simply mean that, in a manner of speaking, certain countries have decided to stake their fortune on a new spiral of the arms race. Question: my country, Czechoslovakia, was once victimized by German imperialism. At present, too, we are troubled by the presence of a huge number of American and West German troops on our western frontier. We welcome Leonid Brezhnev's Berlin initiatives, including the unilateral Soviet steps towards 5/23/1065 disarmament. But after these steps are taken, will the Soviet Union be able to live up to its commitments under the Warsaw Treaty? Answer: the Soviet Union and, we are sure, the other Warsaw Treaty countries as well, will always live up to their commitments. They are quite able to assure the interests of their security. In his Berlin speech, Leonid Brezhnev stated clearly that if the plans we have discussed here are carried out, the Soviet Union will be compelled by the circumstances to take appropriate steps to protect its own security interests and those of the other Warsaw Treaty countries. Question: commenting on your visit to the FRG, certain West German media said the Soviet Union wants to isolate Bonn from NATO, to neutralize the FRG. Have you anything to say on this score? Answer: the Soviet Union has no intention whatever of isolating the Federal Republic of Germany from any other NATO country. What we are trying to bring home, and what we are trying to prove to the government of the FRG, we are also trying to prove to other NATO countries. It is not our custom to drive wedges between states. We have never done so, and have not prepared any such wedges in connection with my visit to the FRG. Question: do your clear and precise statements also apply to the negotiations in Vienna? Answer: the Vienna negotiations have their own image. A correct solution to the issue to which we have referred here would ease the Vienna talks, would make it easier to reach accords there. Conversely, if the NATO countries carry out their plan of deploying new types of nuclear missiles, this will greatly reduce the chances of success at the Vienna talks. I take this opportunity to inform you that so far we have received no reply from the Western participants in the Vienna talks to the proposals of the socialist countries made nearly 18 months ago. It would be a good thing if they finally came around to replying. Question: it is common knowledge that the proposals contained in Leonid Brezhnev's Berlin speech of 6 October were well received by the general public in the Western countries. 66. How do you explain why the governments of the NATO countries failed to take the same positive view of the realistic and constructive proposals contained in Brezhnev's speech? Answer: briefly, I would say that though the United States and some other NATO countries pay lip service to the principle of equality, their true policy is to obtain unilateral advantages in arms and armed forces. But every realist ought to know that the other side will not let itself be outdone and be at a disadvantage. That means continued arms competition, which we firmly condemn. Question: will the expected decision of the NATO session affect the bilateral relations between the USSR and the FRG? Answer: I want you to know, and we did not conceal this in our talks with the statesmen of the FRG, that it will naturally affect the relations between the Soviet Union and the Federal Republic of Germany. In what way? As you can probably see for yourself, it will affect them adversely. We would prefer to avoid these adverse effects. Our proposal is to negotiate, I repeat, to negotiate. This would secure the interests of all the negotiating sides, because no one can impose one's will on anyone else. This means that we search for mutually acceptable decisions. As you see, we are offering a way to avoid adverse effects. Question: do your invitations to Genscher and Schmidt to visit the Soviet Union mean that you are still interested in good relations with the FRG? Answer: bluntly, we are interested in good relations between the FRG and the Soviet Union. We appreciate everything that has been achieved so far. And we would not like our relations to be clouded by anything. We want contacts to continue at all levels, including the summit level. The communiqué which is about to be published says that I have confirmed Chancellor Schmidt's invitation. Foreign Minister Genscher's invitation has also been confirmed. Question: did you get the impression from the present talks that the federal government has a sincere interest in disarmament? Answer: we have been told that it is interested. Such statements were, indeed, made. But you know the FRG's position on 5*67. The issue we have raised here. So every one of you can draw your own conclusion. Question: did I understand you to say that if the NATO session takes no decision, the Soviet Union will be prepared to negotiate a reduction in the number of SS-20 missiles with multiple, independently targetable warheads and their withdrawal to Soviet territory? Answer: yes, we are prepared to discuss a reduction in the number of launching platforms for medium-range missiles. They will remain within our territory. If you had any doubts on this score, I hope my clarification has removed them. In conclusion, I want to say that the talks here in Bonn proceeded in a serious, business-like atmosphere. This was fully in the spirit that marked the earlier meetings between representatives of the Soviet Union and the FRG. Marshal of the Soviet Union D.F. Ustinov. Member of the CCCPSU Politburo and USSR Minister of Defense. Military détente. An imperative of our time. The new Soviet peace initiative is still at the center of world attention. The proposals made during his recent visit to the German Democratic Republic by Leonid Brezhnev, General Secretary of the CCCPSU and Chairman of the USSR Supreme Soviet Presidium, are being actively discussed by governments, political parties, public organizations, and the public at large. As noted in the relevant document of the CCCPSU Politburo, the USSR Supreme Soviet Presidium and the USSR Council of Ministers, the Soviet proposals offer a way for preventing a new spiral of the arms race, for setting out on real disarmament, and for preserving and multiplying the fruits of détente and peaceful cooperation. The Soviet proposals gained the wholehearted approval and support of the Soviet people, the peoples of the socialist community, and progressives all over the world. If they are carried out, this will have a tremendous effect, and first of all will help to back up political with military détente, and create favorable opportunities for consolidating the peaceful coexistence of states with different social systems. This is a point noted by prominent political leaders and statesmen of various countries. At the same time, there are forces opposed to the Soviet proposals. Ruling quarters in, primarily, the United States, the FRG, and Great Britain, are avoiding a concrete reply and are trying to minimize the importance of the constructive Soviet steps and proposals. They prefer propaganda campaigns to any concrete efforts jointly with the socialist community to further military détente. They want propaganda campaigns as a cover for their hostile designs against peace. In substance, despite everything, contrary to common sense, these quarters are trying to prevail on the world public, especially in the West European 69 countries, that NATO must continue its policy of intensifying the arms race and must station qualitatively new American nuclear missile systems in Western Europe. The NATO leadership does not bother to present any proof to back its position. In the absence of such proof, it distorts the facts and refers to NATO's lag behind the Warsaw Treaty countries in many types of weapons, to dangerous disproportions in medium-range missiles, and to a growth of the Soviet war threat. All these arguments are not novel. And every one of them is false. Militarists have always resorted to lies when they wanted a new spiral in the arms race. The whole world has heard Leonid Brezhnev's statement, which clearly defines the essence and principles of the Soviet Union's military doctrine. He said, "The Soviet Union does not seek military superiority. It is not our intention, and never has been, to threaten any state or group of states. Our strategic doctrine is of a purely defensive orientation." This laconic formula by the chairman of our country's Defense Council expresses the general line of the Communist Party and the Soviet government in matters of defense. Throughout its history, ever since the October Revolution, the Soviet Union has consistently followed this defensive doctrine. From the first days of Soviet power, during the Civil War and the foreign armed intervention, we had to defend our socialist gains against numerous enemies. The principles of our military doctrine and its defensive character go back to those early days. During the Great Patriotic War, the Soviet people selflessly defended their freedom and independence against the Nazi invaders. The defensive character of our military doctrine of that time needs no proving. Defending their motherland, the Soviet people and their armed forces crushed the aggressor and made the decisive contribution to the final victory, saving the peoples of the world from fascist enslavement. But that victory had cost us 20 million Soviet lives. And that we can never forget. Naturally, when building and improving our armed forces, we take into account the grim experience of the Second World War. 70. But, as before, our military policy is determined by our love of peace and the need for ensuring effective defense of the socialist motherland. The defensive character of the Soviet military doctrine is clearly expressed in the decisions of the 24th and 25th Congresses of the CPSU. It is legislatively enshrined in the Constitution of the USSR, which provides for the defense of our socialist gains, our people's peaceful labor, and the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Soviet state and its allies. That is the truth. It is incontestable. And nobody can distort it. It is futile for the NATO military leaders to deny the defensive character of the Soviet military doctrine with references to the strength of our armed forces and their ability to crush any aggressor that may risk starting a war. Their methods are not novel. But they do not stand up to criticism. The whole world knows that the Soviet Union is preparing no armed attack on anybody and will never mount any attack. The whole world also knows that the Soviet Army and Navy are constantly ready to repulse an attack by any aggressor, whatever means and methods of warfare he may employ. The retaliation for attacking the Soviet Union and other countries of the socialist community will be inescapable. This we say with all emphasis. While Soviet leadership has a clear understanding of what a war would mean for mankind in the present conditions. This predetermines the active position of the USSR. Today, there is no sensible alternative to peaceful coexistence. Its principles are increasingly taking root in interstate relations. The European Conference that adopted the Final Act, a Charter of Security for the Peoples of Europe, a Charter of Peaceful Life, was convened on the initiative of the countries of the socialist community. Negotiations are underway with the effective participation of the USSR to achieve a complete and universal prohibition of nuclear weapons tests, a ban on radiological weapons, and so on. We want an end to the manufacture of nuclear weapons and a gradual reduction of their stockpiles until they are finally eliminated, with a simultaneous strengthening of political guarantees and guarantees in international law of the security of states, so that nuclear energy is used exclusively for peaceful purposes. The Soviet Union insists on the earliest possible conclusion of treaties and conventions ending the development, production, and acquisition. 71. Mutilation of chemical weapons, providing for their destruction, and outlawing the development of new types and systems of mass annihilation weapons. In the drive for these noble aims, the Soviet Union is cooperating closely with the other socialist countries. The Treaty on the Limitation of Strategic Offensive Arms signed by the Soviet Union and the United States is called upon to play an important role in stabilizing the international situation. While it was being worked out, the attitude of the USA was frequently hesitant and changeable. But ultimately the document was signed. It represents a considered balance of the interests of the two major nuclear powers, and conforms with the peaceful aspirations of all nations. The Soviet Union attaches prime significance to the fact that, upon signing the SALT II Treaty, the USSR and the USA agreed to continue negotiations on the principle of equality and equal security, and to work for significant and substantial numerical reductions and qualitative limitations of strategic arms. It is important that no additional artificial barriers should arise, and that the efforts to achieve accord should be mutual, consistent, and continuous. But one question does arise: which way has the United States been looking of late, and aren't its practical steps after the signing of the SALT II Treaty leading to serious complications that will delay SALT III and burden Soviet-American relations? This is a legitimate question, because the mounting aggressiveness of the NATO bloc, in which the USA is the tune-setter, and the build-up of U.S. military preparations in various parts of the world, are more than obvious. 2. In word, the U.S. leaders also seem to be in favor of peaceful international cooperation, in favor of détente, and of backing it up with military détente. But their deeds are often contrary to their words. They are stoking up fear, intensifying the arms race, and openly preparing for war. Harold Brown, U.S. Secretary of Defense, has publicly declared the U.S. intention to secure NATO's military superiority over the Warsaw Treaty countries by the mid-80s, he gave to UN. 72. Understand that this meant nuclear superiority, giving the United States a potential for guaranteed annihilation. In the USA, discussions have been revived concerning the desirability of a strategic preemptive strike in certain circumstances against military targets in Soviet territory. Given the present state of strategic nuclear forces and means of control, it is not very clear how people in responsible positions can even think of any such strike, because it is absolutely certain that a mighty counterstrike is bound to follow. How is the Soviet Union expected to react to these statements? How is it expected to receive the claims of high-ranking U.S. spokesmen that now the whole globe has become a sphere of NATO interests? Not military experts alone, but everybody else can see that those are not mere words. Behind them are concrete plans and blueprints of war against the Soviet Union and its allies, and the expansionist, hegemonistic policy of reactionary imperialist quarters. The armed forces of the United States are patterned to suit these aggressive postulates and a military doctrine that provides for preemptive strikes against the probable adversary. A program is underway to develop the MX system of mobile missile complexes. In October 1979, the U.S. Navy began getting strategic submarines armed with the new Trident I missile. The testing of 2,600 km range cruise missiles is coming to an end, and preparations are afoot to put them into service. New, more powerful nuclear warheads will soon be ready for the Minuteman ballistic missile. An intensive development is going on of mass annihilation weapons based on new operational principles. Furthermore, the United States is planning to create and station along the borders of the Soviet Union and those of other socialist countries new systems of medium-range weapons capable of strategic missions. Some 600 cruise missiles and Pershing II ballistic missiles are to be deployed in Western Europe. This would not simply add about 1,500 units to the already available forward-based weaponry of the United States and similar weaponry of Great Britain and France within striking distance of the Soviet Union, but would also thereby alter the strategic situation in Europe in NATO's favor. It would increase the power of U.S. strategic nuclear forces and 73. Put the Soviet Union at a disadvantage, compelling it to take appropriate countermeasures. NATO quarters are trying to portray this plan of stationing medium-range nuclear missiles in Europe as an upgrading or modernizing of weaponry. In fact, however, it is the strategy of the United States that is being modernized and made more aggressive. And to suit this, weapons systems are being developed which, as Leonid Brezhnev aptly said, are a mine laid under the very foundation of the edifice of European peace. The numerical strength of NATO armed forces in Europe is being boosted, though it already amounts to more than 3 million men. The system of control and coordination is being improved. What is more, all types of armed forces and service arms are getting new weapons, and this in high gear. Huge stockpiles of weaponry are being laid up in West European countries for US troops that may be deployed to Europe in so-called critical situations. The combat capacity of military transport aircraft and airborne landing troops is being built up. Nor is Europe an exception. The US military presence in Japan is being extended. NATO is studying the question of supplying modern weaponry to China. It is encouraging Peking's war preparations against neighboring states. In the Middle East, attempts are being made to create a new aggressive alliance under US auspices embracing Israel, Egypt, and a few other countries. The activation of a 100,000-man rapid deployment force for punitive functions is going ahead in full gear. The United States has permanently stationed a naval force in the zone of the Indian Ocean in defiance of protests from the littoral states. In sum, the facts show that on the pretext of a non-existent Soviet war threat, NATO and the United States are continuously building up armaments against the Soviet Union. The decisions that the United States is imposing on the NATO bloc are based on force as the chief vehicle of imperialist policy. The result would not only destabilize relations between the USA and the USSR, but would also cause universal instability, and deprive the world of any clear peaceful perspective. This would probably please those influential quarters in the United States and other imperialist states that fear peaceful coexistence and that associate the future of their class with the 74. Arms race and militarist policy. In the recent past, they started a Cold War. They viciously resisted the emergence of détente. Their intentions and actions are invariably focused on impairing the positions of the Soviet Union and the other socialist countries. But the times when aggressive forces could abuse other nations with impunity are long since over, and gone for good. Those who seek military advantages and superiority, those who are rattling their swords, ought to wake up to the fact that they may badly burn their own fingers. If, contrary to common sense and the goodwill of the socialist countries, the NATO states turn Western Europe into a launching site for US strategic arms, they will get a firm and convincing reply from the other side. Europe is saturated and oversaturated with weaponry like no other region of the world. It is high time to set about lowering the level of confrontation between the two main armed groupings located here, and to do so in earnest. As we see it, this is an entirely realistic task. Why is it not being tackled? Because there are still people in the West who measure their own and other people's interests with different yardsticks. That is also the reason why the Vienna talks on reducing armed forces and armaments in Central Europe, and many other disarmament talks have made no progress for so long a time. As again emphatically stressed by Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet Union suggests that appropriate forums examine the set of problems related to military détente in its entirety, and that agreements are reached, each of which would project and complement the others. There is no type of weapon and no military problem that the Soviet Union would place outside the frame of a settlement if other countries reciprocate. Steps limiting and reducing the military potentials of states should, as we see it, combine with measures reducing the danger of an accidental nuclear or non-nuclear conflict and hindering covert preparation of a sudden attack. This will make for a more stable mechanism of cooperation among states, and pave the way for considerably more effective solutions in the field of disarmament in terms of both quantity and quality. 75. Leonid Brezhnev's Berlin proposals offer a comprehensive approach and are moved by the desire to encompass the chief elements of military détente in Europe. They are convincing evidence of our goodwill and love of peace. At the same time, they show the solidity of the Soviet Union's international positions and confidence in its strength and capability. Leonid Brezhnev said we were prepared to reduce the present number of medium-range nuclear missiles deployed in the western regions of our country on the condition that no additional American medium-range nuclear missiles designed to alter the strategic situation on the continent should be deployed in Western Europe. The offer concerned a cut in the number of Soviet nuclear missiles as well as a reduction of their nuclear charge. If the NATO governments really wanted to negotiate the issue of medium-range weapons, one would think they should be naturally interested in the Soviet proposal and should come out with a possible basis for talks. But no, nothing of the kind has happened. On the heels of Brezhnev's speech, the United States told its allies in categorical terms that it wanted no changes in the already prepared decisions on deploying new American medium-range nuclear missiles in Europe. The U.S. leadership and its supporters in Western Europe have not bothered to tell the public that if the new nuclear missiles they are planning to station in Europe are eventually put to use by their owners, the retaliation, too, will affect the West European countries concerned. In other words, these plans are going to make things more dangerous for the West Europeans, though this could well be avoided because the Soviet Union, as Brezhnev has reaffirmed, will never use nuclear weapons against states that have renounced the production and acquisition of such weapons, and have none on their territory. Western public opinion is also being misled about another important issue. The medium-range missiles stationed in the western regions of the Soviet Union are comparable in number to similar missiles in the possession of just Great Britain and France. The many hundreds of American nuclear delivery vehicles available on aircraft carriers constantly cruising within range of Soviet territory and at air bases in European NATO countries are deliberately ignored. Yet, if all the weaponry of the forward-based 76 system intended for action against targets in Soviet territory is taken into account, the picture will be completely different from the one presented by Western propaganda. And that is already causing us legitimate concern. The public is also being deceived about the following: the NATO Council's December session is not going to examine any plans for substituting new American systems for old ones. It is going to examine a program that will radically alter the quantity and quality of the U.S. strategic nuclear potential deployed in Western Europe. The wish to portray NATO's aggressive plans as modernization and a forced countermeasure is causing its leaders to distort the facts and to pervert the sense of the Soviet proposals for reducing nuclear medium-range missiles. One can only marvel at the cavalier manner in which top-ranking Western leaders interpret past and present steps buttressing the defenses of the Soviet Union, and in which they interpret its intentions. It is quite true that Soviet medium-range nuclear missiles are being modernized, for they have been in service for several decades. But the number of medium-range nuclear delivery vehicles stationed in the European part of the Soviet Union has not been increased in the past 10 years by a single missile or aircraft. On the contrary, there has been a drop in their numbers as well as their nuclear power. Moved by a sincere desire to set an example and go from words to deeds, the Soviet Union has, following consultations and accords with its allies, taken the decision to unilaterally reduce the strength of Soviet troops in the German Democratic Republic. Within the next 12 months some 20,000 Soviet servicemen, 1,000 tanks, and a certain amount of other weaponry are to be withdrawn to the Soviet Union. The significance of the withdrawal of so large a contingent of military units from a region where the armed forces of the sides stand face to face ought to be clear to everyone. NATO's upper echelons admit that the Soviet decision came as a surprise to them, but are trying to belittle its importance. By doing so they are contradicting themselves. Recently, at the Vienna talks, NATO spokesman called for a simultaneous withdrawal from Central Europe of 68,000 servicemen and 1,700 tanks by the Soviet Union, and 29,000 servicemen, 90 nuclear delivery, 77 vehicles and 1,000 nuclear warheads by the United States. This they portrayed as crucial lore military détente. Now, however, our unilateral decision to withdraw a large troop contingent is described by NATO leaders as irrelevant. It is hard to keep a sense of proportion if there is no wish to deal honestly. The evidence is that the NATO leadership wants to upgrade its weaponry first and then to negotiate an East-West reduction of armed forces and armaments in Central Europe from a position of strength. Evidently, the parity official Western spokesman had once advocated no longer suits the NATO strategists. That is why they clamor for an arms build-up. The Soviet Union stands firm on the principle of equality and equal security. And if anyone expects the process of armed forces reductions in Europe to continue to run exclusively at the expense of the Soviet Union and its allies, he is badly mistaken. We will negotiate with the Western countries, and this includes Europe, only on a basis of reciprocity. Leonid Brezhnev's proposals for a further extension of confidence-building measures in Europe are also highly important. These measures follow from the final act of the European Conference. The Soviet Union has suggested a mutual undertaking to hold no war exercises involving more than 40,000 to 50,000 men, and to give notice of major exercises of ground forces not 3 but 4 weeks in advance, and this not from a level of 25,000 men but of 20,000, this also applying to any troop movements in excess of 20,000 men. That would be one more step closer to military détente, and would substantially back up the relaxation of tension from the angle of security and greater confidence. Naturally, the proposals of the Soviet Union and the other socialist countries on giving advance notice of large-scale air and naval maneuvers near the territorial waters of other countries that participated in the European Conference still hold good. There can hardly be any question of confidence if the scale of war exercises is continuously increased, as this is done by NATO in Europe. NATO maneuvers each involve several 100,000 men from all arms of the service. Vast amounts of various weaponry are tested. Many of the exercises are of a strategic scale and amount to practical rehearsals of military operations against Warsaw Treaty countries. 78. As noted by Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet Union is prepared to examine any other ideas aimed at building confidence among states, and reducing the danger of an outbreak of war in Europe. As soon as the SALT II treaty comes into force, we are prepared to begin the important SALT III negotiations. The USSR is willing to discuss limiting not only the intercontinental but also other types of weapons with consideration for all related factors. Those responsible political leaders, including some in the West, who believe that the Soviet proposals made in Brezhnev's Berlin speech have created a largely new situation and have set the idea of military détente in Europe on a new course, are absolutely right. If the West has any elementary desire to come to terms, the basis for this where we are concerned is quite obviously on hand, and a solid basis it is, providing realistic conditions for rapid progress. The matter now rests with the Western countries. If those who now determine U.S. policy and that of certain other NATO countries turn their backs on the existing opportunities for coming to terms about a real military détente and the peaceful future of Europe, and if they give preference to attempts at dictating from positions of strength and to reviving the Cold War rather than following a policy of honest agreements and mutual confidence, they will thereby assume a grave responsibility before the peoples of their own and of other countries. Asterisk. The Soviet Union constantly and consistently follows a policy of peace. Certainly, it has to take into account that in various parts of the world there are forces interested in stoking up tensions and in the arms race, and that there are elements who are nursing aggressive plans. For this reason, our armed forces are always kept at a level matching the modern standards, and are always ready to throw back any aggressor. Closely rallied round the party and its Leninist Central Committee, our Army and Navy personnel, like all other Soviet people, unanimously approve and support the new peace initiatives advanced by Leonid Brezhnev. The wisdom, farsightedness, and fairness of these initiatives give the Soviet people new strength and energy for the great tasks of communist construction. Pravda, October 22, 1979. Marshal N. V. Agarkov, Chief of the General Staff of the USSR Armed Forces and First Deputy Minister of Defense. The Soviet Threat. Myth and Reality. Despite the resistance of imperialist reaction, the process of relieving international tensions continues to be the leading tendency of modern time. The road to the present level of détente was neither simple nor easy. It was laid with perseverance by the foreign policy of the Soviet Union and the other countries of the socialist community which had, at a certain stage, met with the understanding of realistic Western statesmen. The positive changes registered in the world were largely made possible by the implementation of the peace program advanced by the 24th Congress and further projected by the 25th Congress of the CPSU. The changes for the better are apparent. As L.I. Brezhnev observed, these benign changes, which became especially evident in the 70s, were given the name of détente. They are palpable and concrete. They are expressed in the acceptance and formalization in international documents of a kind of code of rules for honest and fair relations between states, raising a legal, moral, and political barrier to any devotees of military adventure. The most pressing task facing humanity today is to stop the arms race and to eliminate the danger of a nuclear world war. These lofty aims are also served by the meeting of Leonid Brezhnev, General Secretary of the CCCPSU and Chairman of the USSR Supreme Soviet Presidium, and US President James Carter in Vienna in June 1979. The main outcome of the Vienna meeting was the signing of the Treaty on the Limitation of Strategic Offensive Arms, which is in content far broader and deeper than the interim agreement that is now in force. It raises definite barriers to any further proliferation and qualitative improvement of a number of the more destructive strategic weapons. 80. What is more, it gives a start to their reduction, paving the way to larger, all-inclusive agreements. It is not surprising, therefore, that all those who cherish world peace regard the outcome of the Vienna meeting as an important step towards improving not only Soviet-American relations, but also the international climate as a whole. There are forces, however, that are obviously opposed to all this. That is why the big lie about a Soviet war threat is being spread intensively in the United States, certain West European countries, and also in China. To be sure, the lie about a Soviet war threat and inventions about Moscow's perfidy are no novelty. Attempts to exploit lies that the Soviet Union is posing a threat to peace had been made repeatedly, especially at the time of the Cold War. Now, the West is trying to turn this lie into a long-term political and ideological campaign against the Soviet Union and its foreign policy of peace. Everything is turned bottom side up. The true purpose of the foreign policy of the CPSU and the Soviet Union is portrayed in a false light in order to distract attention from the real war danger created by the policy of militarization and the unbridled arms race fostered by the military-industrial complex of the USA and the NATO militarists. They are trying to justify their policy of intensive arming, to portray this as a forced move, and to allay the annoyance of large sections of people with misinformation about the allegedly growing military expenditures of the Soviet Union. The whole world knows perfectly well that the Soviet Union has never threatened anyone with war and has never attacked anyone. This is convincingly proved by the more than 60 years history of the USSR. The moment it came into existence, the young Soviet Republic issued the first appeal for peace and disarmament in history. Lenin's decree on peace was among its first legislative acts. And it was Lenin who advanced the principle of the peaceful coexistence of the Soviet state with the capitalist countries. If there was a war threat at that time, it came from the AG 623-1081 aggressive section of world imperialism, which tried to crush the Soviet government that it hated. 14 countries, including the United States, Great Britain, France, and Japan, joined in a crusade against the world's first socialist republic. And in those days, too, the rulers of capitalist states covered up this aggression with Pharisaic slogans of combating the non-existent Red Danger. But who created a danger, and for whom, hardly needs telling. In 1924, after the power of Soviets had been upheld and the country tackled the tasks of peaceful construction, the Soviet Union reduced its more than 5 million strong armed forces to a mere 600,000 men. This was done by our party and government when the nation was encircled by hostile capitalist states. Is that not evidence enough of the Soviet Union's genuine love of peace? The Soviet Union wanted peace and peace only. And it was not to blame for the fact that it had had to build its new life and at the same time buttress its defenses. This was forced upon us by the danger of an armed attack of the imperialist powers, which, while howling about a Soviet threat, had repeatedly resorted to force to test the solidity of the socialist state. This was the case in 1929 in the region of the Chinese Eastern Railway in the clash with Chinese warlords. This was the case in 1938 in the region of Lake Hassan and in 1939 at Kalangol, where Soviet and Mongolian troops crushed an invading Japanese force. Who created the danger at that time, and for whom, is evidently needless to explain. At the end of the 30s the imperialist states' attitude towards the USSR was the same. And it is common knowledge what the hypocritical talk of certain influential Western leaders about a communist threat resulted in at a time when ominous clouds of another world war were gathering over the world. It was obvious that a new war was imminent, and that peace was endangered by fascism. But even in those conditions, defying the facts, the West continued to howl about a Soviet threat. Unfortunately, at that time our country failed to win the support of other states in the struggle for peace. The notorious Munich policy of appeasement, a policy of moral and economic encouragement of the aggressor by the Western powers, led to 82. An unprecedentedly brutal and bloody world war. And it would be a good thing for certain people today to recall that the first victims of that war were those who had directly or indirectly facilitated its outbreak in the hope of directing it eastward. The countries of Western Europe fell one after the other under the onslaught of the ranting and raving Nazis. The Soviet Union, grappling in mortal combat with the perfidious enemy, was the only country that managed to halt the Nazis and then, together with its allies of the anti-Hitler coalition, to bring them to their knees. Our motherland paid a high price, the lives of 20 million of its people, for defending its honor, freedom, and independence, and made a decisive contribution to the liberation of many countries of Europe and Asia. Here, too, the truth of history is on our side. Not the Soviet Union had threatened anyone, not the Soviet Union had started the war. On the contrary, repulsing an aggression, the Soviet Union saved humanity from fascism. Almost immediately after the war, when the Soviet Union was occupied in restoring its war-ravaged economy, certain quarters in the United States and Great Britain again began beating the drums about a Soviet war threat and nursing perfidious and devilish plans against us, their recent allies of the anti-Hitler coalition. In 1948, Churchill suggested an atomic war against the USSR, and in 1949 the USA even had a war plan under the code name Drop Shot, whose authors proposed that 300 atomic bombs and 20,000 tons of conventional bombs should be dropped on the USSR. And all this was covered up with slogans of combating the communist peril. What Soviet threat could there have been, we might ask, if it was Churchill and Truman who were brandishing the atom bomb in those days while we still had no such weapon? 2. The lies about a Soviet war threat are designed to cover up the imperialist-inspired arms race and place the blame for it on the USSR. But the facts refute these lies. We were not the first to start the arms race, nor were we the first to form military political blocs. The home and foreign policy of the Soviet Union is directed 6*83 to creating conditions for peaceful, constructive life, to the security of the motherland. Our country took only the requisite countermeasures in face of the successive challenges of the West. It is common knowledge that the first atomic bombs were dropped not by Russian but by American flyers on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the absence of any military necessity. The Soviet Union was not the first to begin building nuclear-armed submarines, or to arm ICBMs and submarine-launched ballistic missiles with multiple, independently targetable warheads. Neither were we the ones to begin arming strategic aircraft with dozens of cruise missiles with a range of thousands of kilometers. It is the United States and its NATO allies that are stimulating the arms race, as they had in the past, and that are dragging continuously growing military budgets through their legislatures and fanning a militaristic frenzy. The imperialist elements in the NATO countries, notably representatives of the powerful military-industrial complexes there, are fiercely resisting any and all steps in the field of disarmament. They and their Chinese confederates want to continue the already bankrupt policy from positions of strength and are whipping up a military psychosis. Isn't it a fact that when the leaders of the NATO countries met in Washington in May 1978 they demonstratively adopted a long-term program for a further build-up of NATO's military potential during the 80s? They reaffirmed their intention of increasing their military expenditure in real terms by 3% annually in the years to come. Suffice it to say that just the United States intends to increase its 1980 military allocations to $138,000 million. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, has not increased its defense expenditure in recent years. Consequently, if the comparison is drawn in terms of military expenditure, there is just one clear answer to the question of who threatens whom. Or take the question of military bases. It is common knowledge that our country is girdled by the military bases manned by American troops and armed with large numbers of nuclear weapons. The forward basing concept is candidly aggressive. U.S. naval vessels, including nuclear-armed aircraft carriers and submarines, are on constant military duty in the vicinity of the 84 Soviet frontiers. Yet, there never were, nor are, any Soviet military bases near the territory of the United States. Here, too, we are entitled to ask, who threatens whom? And this example, voices resound in the West that the Soviet Union is expanding its military presence in Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. Peking, too, is raising the alarm over this. But the answer to this charge is very brief. Not counting a limited number of Soviet military specialists to show the use of Soviet-supplied weapons and technology, there isn't a single Soviet soldier, a single Soviet company, let alone any unit of Soviet troops, in those regions, nor has there ever been. The Soviet Union has never interfered, nor does it interfere, in the internal affairs of any other country. And that cannot be said of those who are trying to distort the facts and who sling mud at our foreign policy. Ask them, who took a direct part in the Korean War, who shed the blood of the long-suffering people of Vietnam for so many years, and who continues to keep troops or send mercenaries to countries in Africa or South America, and other regions of the world? To ascribe to the Soviet Union perfidious designs in Europe, Africa, the Middle East or towards the United States, as Brezhnev said, is nothing but an unseemly trick in the political struggle and has no relation to the facts. 5. The world knows perfectly well that over the recent years the Soviet Union has come forward with a large set of proposals for military détente, and for stopping the arms race, including the nuclear race. But the facts have shown that military as well as political détente is not to the taste of the Cold Warriors. And it is to torpedo détente that the lie about a Soviet war threat is being exploited to the hilt in the United States, China, and certain other countries. It is a revealing fact that this shop-worn lie is being extensively used by the opponents of SALT II. They maintain that the balance of military strength is strongly tilting in favor of the Soviet Union, and try to prove that in the nuclear age only superior strength, rather than renunciation of the arms race and treaties limiting strategic arms, can guarantee the security of the United 85 States. This point of view is being spread, among others, by the Committee on the Present Danger formed in the United States, which is zealously propagating the alleged risk of SALT II. Here is how this risk is construed: if the United States fails to deploy new strategic systems soon, by the mid-80s the Soviet strategic force will be much superior to the American, while SALT II would prevent the United States from taking appropriate countermeasures. Examine this construction more closely and you will see that its authors are manipulating the facts or simply inventing things. Certain U.S. leaders informed about the state of strategic offensive arms on both sides, are deliberately and grossly perverting the true relation of Soviet-American strength. They pluck out of the treaty the provisions that concern ground-based intercontinental ballistic missiles and describe it as something next to a disaster for the United States that the Soviet Union will be allowed to have 820 launchers of ICBMs with multiple, independently targetable warheads. They say nothing of the fact that each of the 41 U.S. nuclear-armed submarines carries 16 ballistic missiles, and that each such missile may have up to 14 MIRV-D warheads. Neither do they mention the third component of the strategic offensive forces, the strategic B-52 bomber that may simultaneously carry up to 20 nuclear warheads. The United States has something like 600 such bombers. Besides, the Pentagon is planning to produce a new type of wide fuselage aircraft that will each carry up to 75 cruise missiles. If the opponents of SALT II had named the number of nuclear warheads carried by the U.S. strategic triad, the nuclear power controlled by the United States would have been clear to all, and so would the groundlessness of the U.S. propaganda inventions. And again we ask, what Soviet threat are the inspirers of the new anti-Soviet campaign talking about? Certain opponents of SALT II are trying to frighten the U.S. public that the Soviet Union would gain first strike nuclear superiority. They even give probable civilian casualty figures of the sides in a reciprocal nuclear strike. To this Leonid Brezhnev once rebutted, the Soviet Union is and always has been a convinced opponent of this sort of concept. Our efforts are designed precisely to prevent any first or second strikes, and in general to 86. Prevent a nuclear war. Our approach to these issues may be put thus: the defense potential of the Soviet Union has got to be big enough to prevent anyone from risking to break up our peaceful life. Our policy is to reduce armaments, to relieve the military confrontation, and not to seek any superiority in armaments. What could be clearer? And we have no other doctrine. The world has had ample opportunities to see that the Soviet Union always matches its words with deeds. Our country initiated the proposals for the complete and unconditional banning of atomic weapons, for their destruction, and for using nuclear energy exclusively for peaceful purposes. SALT II is to be followed by SALT III. A set of multilateral agreements helping to limit the production and proliferation of nuclear weapons has already been concluded on the initiative of the USSR. Many other Soviet proposals for reducing armaments and for disarmament are in the discussion stage, on reducing armed forces and armaments in Central Europe, prohibiting the development, production, and stockpiling of chemical weapons, and destroying their stockpiles, prohibiting new types and systems of mass annihilation weapons, particularly radiological weapons, and so on. Implementation of these and other proposals would help to lower the level of military confrontation, to back up détente with measures in the military field, and to heighten confidence among states. In the United States, much is being said these days about the problem of controlling fulfillment of the SALT II provisions, and this with the inference that the Soviet Union is intent on violating the treaty. The Soviet Union has never violated any treaties, including the one on limiting ABM systems and the interim agreement on certain measures with respect to the limitation of strategic offensive arms. Nor does it have any such intentions in the future. We hold that the Treaty on the Limitation of Strategic Offensive Arms is a balanced accord meeting the interests of both the Soviet Union and the United States. It helps to contain the nuclear arms race. It offers hope for deepening the process of détente in international relations. It helps to lessen the danger of a nuclear war breaking out. The treaty will also be an important frontier for a further concentration of efforts on reducing strategic 87. Offensive arms and other types of nuclear and conventional weapons. If fully implemented, it may become the biggest action ever taken to bridle the nuclear arms race. ***45. Despite the intrigues of enemies of détente, the GPSU and the Soviet government steadfastly follow a policy of consolidating peace and extending détente to the entire world, so that people everywhere should enjoy the benefits of peace and arrange their lives in freedom. This peace policy is broadly backed by the peoples of the socialist countries and by millions of people throughout the world. No one, neither the slanderers in the West nor the Chinese hegemonists, will ever succeed in discrediting the peace initiatives of the Soviet Union. The facts refute all the lies about a Soviet war threat. Still, the CPSU and the Soviet government are compelled to reckon with the fact that there are forces in the West, and not only the West, that have a stake in the arms race and in creating a climate of fear and hostility. Hence, while following an active foreign policy of peace, the Soviet Union is compelled to face up to the really existing threat. In so doing, the party and government take constant guidance in Lenin's well-known phrase that our steps towards peace must be accompanied by military preparedness. And that this love of peace and preparedness, as the USSR Constitution says, are fused in our policy should be borne in mind by all amateurs of military adventure. Yes, we have powerful up-to-date armed forces. But the Soviet armed forces are no threat to anyone. They have never been used to capture foreign territory or to enslave the peoples of other countries. Our army is maintained and improved exclusively for the purpose of defending the socialist gains, the peaceful labor of Soviet people, the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Soviet Union. Deeply conscious of their responsibility for the destiny of our country, Soviet soldiers stand shoulder to shoulder with soldiers of the fraternal armies of countries of the socialist community, vigilantly guarding socialism and peace. Pravda, August 2, 1979. General of the Army A. A. Yepeshev, Chief of the Central Political Department of the Soviet Army and Navy. The lies about a Soviet war threat and the true danger to peace. Countering the détente initiatives of the Soviet Union and the other socialist countries, the imperialist world, hand in hand with the Maoists, has taken a series of steps that have gravely complicated the international situation at the junction of the 70s and 80s. It has been clear for some time, Leonid Brezhnev said to a Pravda correspondent recently, that governing quarters in the United States and some other NATO countries have set a course that is hostile to détente, a course that is designed to escalate the arms race and that tends to increase the war danger. The turn from Cold War to a policy of sound realism encountered dogged resistance from imperialist reactionary quarters. Dreading the social consequences of détente, militarists seize upon all sorts of pretexts to discredit and torpedo it. Brezhnev has stressed that the true reason for the present deterioration of the international climate has nothing in common with the events in Afghanistan. If there had been no Afghanistan, he said, certain quarters in the United States and NATO would surely have found some other pretext to aggravate the world situation. The deliberate aggravation of the international situation by the US imperialists is expressive of their resentment against the consolidation of socialism's positions, the upswing of the national liberation movement, and the strengthening of the forces favoring détente and peace. The hostile reaction of the imperialist forces to the events in Afghanistan is due to the fact that their own and their abettors' plan of turning that country into a military bridgehead on the southern border of the Soviet Union has been foiled. 7/23/1089. The attempts of the US imperialists to justify their militarist preparations with the lie about a Soviet war threat haven't a leg to stand on. It is common knowledge that the first steps taken by our socialist state were in the direction of excluding wars from the life of human society. The day after the Great October Socialist Revolution, the Soviet Republic adopted Lenin's famous decree on peace, telling all people everywhere that a state of the working people had come into the world that would do its utmost to establish universal peace. The Socialist Revolution in Russia was the first in history to come out so conclusively for peace among nations and states. The principle of the peaceful coexistence of states with different social systems, renouncing unjust wars as an ugly product of exploitative societies, became one of the mainsprings of Soviet foreign policy. Imperialism's reactionary forces mounted attack upon attack on this principle and the peace policy of the Soviet Union and the other socialist states on the spurious pretext of a Soviet war threat. Militarism is nothing but a specific expression of capitalism's general crisis. In certain cases the social, spiritual, and political product of militarism has become so obviously ugly and inhuman that even bourgeois ideologues are compelled to admit it. Even though imperialism cannot win a modern war, it is still able to start one. This is why more and more people of widely differing views are aware that the future depends largely on whether the forces of progress manage to put up effective barriers to the growth of militarism, which imperils the future of humanity. Present-day militarism is a constant propagator of anti-Sovietism and of incendiary manipulation with the lie of a red peril. In recent years there have been periods marked by especially frantic attempts at aggravating the international climate, creating political complications, and escalating the arms race. A variety of forms and methods are employed for this purpose. Recently, for example, Europe was visited by a group of US senators to examine the chances of a Soviet attack. And their 90. Summary report confirmed the reality of a destructive Red invasion of Europe and its occupation in a matter of several days. In the wake of this provocation, a committee on the present danger was formed in the USA to expose Soviet expansionism. Apart from psychological pressure that such committees and funds, associations, and councils exert on public opinion, they have more concrete aims, one of these being to rein in the Vienna talks on reducing armed forces and armaments in Central Europe. What these groups want is to give scope for the actions of those who are doggedly preparing the material groundwork for another war. The 70s have shown the vast socio-economic possibilities of détente. Despite its conflicting nature, détente has shown that the working people, the mass of the people, have a vital stake in the relaxation of tensions, and that the socialist world has still more accelerated its rate of development. This triggered a violent reaction among the monopoly bourgeoisie. In fact, Brezhnev has said, the aggressive circles of the capitalist world react to their defeats in the social battles, to their loss of colonial possessions, to the departure from capitalism of more and more countries, to the successes of the socialist world, and to the rising influence of communist parties in bourgeois states, with frantic escalations of war preparation. But to do so, they must have ideological confirmation and justification. And that purpose is served by one of the most vicious and Pharisaic lies of bourgeois propaganda, the lie of a so-called Soviet war threat. If you examine the substance of the many propaganda campaigns now mounted by professional bourgeois ideologists in the context of psychological warfare against socialism, you will see that sustaining the notion of communist aggressiveness in the public mind is the pivotal objective of the theorists of militarism. In the effort to give their policy an ideological foundation, the imperialist advocates of the arms race stick at nothing, and aren't even concerned about elementary logic. When they want more money for weaponry, they frighten parliaments and the public with the predominance of Soviet power, and when they want to show the electorate how well they handle matters of defense, they boast of the absolute military superiority of the West. The latest howl about a mounting Soviet war threat is being raised in the West largely because the monopolies are out to get 7*91 maximally profitable orders and to prevent any slow-up of the arms race. Various lies have been put into circulation about the Soviet Union breaking its treaty commitments, about the advantages it reaps from the recently signed Strategic Offensive Arms Limitation Treaty, and about Soviet superiority in medium-range missiles. The American, British and West German press maintains that the USA is behind the USSR in tanks, artillery, submarines, and missiles. These estimates are served up with bias, and with the sole purpose of hustling parliaments and governments into approving still greater expenditures. Regrettably, the lie of a Soviet threat pays off almost unfailingly, facilitating the material preparations for war, and consequently producing more dividends for the monopolies. The lie of a Soviet war threat enables reactionaries to attack the rights of the working people, to curtail bourgeois democratic freedoms, and to step up anti-communist propaganda. Look back at the history of our age and you will see that fascist regimes and totalitarian states and systems arose, as a rule, behind the specious screen of a Red or Soviet peril, justifying their inhuman activity with the need for containing world communism. The bourgeois propaganda machine is browbeating the man in the street with systematic releases of new facts about the growth of the Soviet military potential and the Soviet edge in missiles, submarines, and the like, putting him in fear of the spurious Soviet threat. This is helping the imperialist upper echelons to maintain the prevailing social status quo, that is, the system where some dominate and the others are exploited. Behind the smokescreen of a Soviet threat, imperialists do not hesitate to use armed force to suppress revolutionary action. The lie of a Soviet war threat is also used to alter the prevailing international situation and interstate relations to the advantage of the military-industrial complex. In other words, the Pharisaic lie is exploited as the chief tool of undermining détente and taking the world back to Cold War times. To see the absurdity of the outcry about a Soviet war threat, it is enough to recapitulate the measures taken by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union to secure détente. The program of further struggle for peace and international cooperation, and for the freedom and independence of the PEO. 92. PIs advanced by the 25th Congress of the CPSU won worldwide response and support. It is a broad set of measures that would, if put into effect, push back the danger of another world war and curb the arms race. As the Soviet Union sees it, bilateral and regional agreements could lead to the conclusion of a world treaty on the non-use of force in international relations. Fresh proof of the socialist country's fidelity to the principle of the peaceful coexistence of countries with different social systems was given in Leonid Brezhnev's proposals made in Berlin on October 6, 1979. We must not forget, however, that the menace of a nuclear war still exists, and that it causes alarm for the future. In the circumstances, the Soviet Union has to back up its peace moves with maintaining its defense capability of repulsing any and all aggressors. This is why the imperialist camp keeps exploiting the lie of a Soviet war threat. Without this lie it would hardly be able to carry on its policy of expansion, oppression, anti-communism, and anti-Sovietism. The malicious lie of a Soviet war threat is one of the chief means it uses to justify its militarist policy. In short, the lie of a Soviet war threat is a convenient ideological and political vindication of the arms race in capitalist countries, and a peculiar substantiation of the need for an anti-communist policy. The socially reactionary nature of the lie is obvious. So is the fact that it cannot have a long life. For it is more than obvious that the main threat to peace comes from militarism. Militarism, which Lenin described as a vital manifestation of capitalism, is one of the most characteristic features of modern bourgeois society. It does not amount to a simple militarization of the state. It is much more sweeping subordination, clad or not in bourgeois democratic garb, of a country's economic, political, and cultural life to the needs of the war machine, that principal instrument of imperialist policy. The bourgeoisie cannot keep its rule secure without reliance on armed force. This is why militarism is witnessed not only in the big imperialist states, but also in the medium-sized and small countries, though admittedly to a different degree. It is rooted in the exploitative nature of society, and exists, as Lenin noted, in all 93 capitalist states, even those that are outwardly neutral. It is one of the built-in social properties of imperialism and permeates all areas of capitalist society. Bourgeois scholars, too, admit that. West German sociologist D. Senghaus says in his book Armaments and Militarism, for example, that modern militarism of capitalist society has wiped out the borderline between the civilian and military spheres. G. Ackley, professor at California State Polytechnic College, says, too, in the modern military in American society, that these days the U.S. military establishment has penetrated to all areas of the social structure. Present-day militarism encompasses the armed forces, the military-industrial basis, military research centers, the administration, and military ideological concepts. All these elements are closely linked, and are focused on militarism's chief social role as a means of armed coercion. At present, the militarist forces are bent on buttressing their positions. They see them threatened by détente and the improvement of the international climate. Attacking détente, many bourgeois theorists say that its absence would not necessarily lead to war. Zbigniew Brzezinski, President Carter's national security advisor, argues that not war but a series of intermediate conditions are the alternative to détente, for when tensions had run high there had been no war. In other words, certain quarters prefer Cold War to peaceful coexistence that in so many ways inhibits the socio-political resources of militarism. Another characteristic of modern militarism is the merger between the arms-making monopolies and the machinery of state. This creates a predatory social hybrid, the military-industrial complex, which has all the conflicting elements typical of the capitalist system. In recent years, as we know, the capitalist economy has been dogged by severe instability, recessions, galloping inflation, and endless monetary crises caused largely by the irrepressibly escalating militarization and arms race, coupled with a warped development of economic structures. The fact that the NATO countries annually burn something like $150,000 million in the furnace of military preparation is, after all, bound to have its consequences. These are highly contradictory. On the one hand, militarism is a convenient way of amassing fantastic super profits, on the other, the process inevitably impairs. 94. Capitalism's economic mechanism, which is visibly faltering these days. Despite the insistent demands of the mass of the people in the capitalist states to limit the growth of military budgets, the flywheel of the arms race is not turning any slower. The insanity of militarism is all the more apparent when you compare the arms expenditures with the allocations to social needs. Suffice it to say that in the United States the military allocations are 250% or higher than those to education and health. Modern militarism is also marked by the maximum use of all the latest achievements of science and technology in the military field. Nearly 70% of the funds spent on science in the United States, for example, go to military research, with nearly 80% of the research personnel engaged in the development of various weapons. This has cost the country more than $60,000 million in the past 5 years. The bulk of these funds were spent on the development of the strategic nuclear missile forces, on new aircraft, cruise missiles, qualitatively new missile systems, submarine missile launchers, ABM systems, laser techniques, and anti-sub weaponry. The input of funds, government orders, and the best scientific brains is continuous. As a result, the military fields of science have advanced far more rapidly than other fields, with science turning into one of the key elements of militarism as a powerful accelerator of the arms race and a challenge in the contest between the two systems, a challenge that the other side cannot afford to leave unanswered. Modern militarism also has certain specific features in the cultural sphere. It is probably safe to say that there is a relatively self-sufficient ideology of militarism, that particular area of bourgeois ideology which vindicates the arms race and the aggressive policy of reactionary quarters in terms of theory. The militarist ideology in a nutshell is a mine laid against the security of nations and against any concrete peace moves, and an ideology that justifies the preparations for another war. The above-mentioned features of modern militarism speak of its greater adaptation to the new conditions, and certainly show that its social and political role in bourgeois society has not declined in the least. 95. 2. The Chinese militarists are, in effect, operating hand in hand with the Western imperialists. The present-day situation inside China is marked by a further build-up of militarist tendencies, which have invaded almost all areas of society. The most salient point here is that in substance the militarist aspects of the Maoist ideology are focused in just one direction against the enemy number one, the Soviet Union. The documents of recent CPC congresses, the utterances of PRC leaders, and the malevolent Maoist propaganda at home and abroad harp on the malicious falsehood that China's war preparations are necessitated by a growing threat from the north. All Peking propaganda is aimed at vindicating the Maoists' anti-Soviet policy, the country's militarization, and the privations that war preparations and the arms race spell for the mass of the people. Maoist militarism is not, on the whole, a simple militarization of society, but rather a way of life. Unprecedented in history is the special status of army men in the People's Republic of China. So is the fact that the lion's share of the budget is earmarked for military purposes, and that ideological campaigns are mounted continuously to stimulate the country's preparations for war. At present, China is the only country in the world whose leaders venture to publicly advocate a world war, which they claim to be fatally inevitable and, of all things, objectively progressive. At the June 1979 session of the National People's Congress, Hua Guofeng maintained that factors auguring war continue to develop. And today, Peking assertions that war is inevitable and that war is a thing of the near future are no longer to be taken as mere, inoffensive rhetoric. Behind them stands the policy of a large state with considerable material resources and manpower. All the latest major state and party forums in the PRC have reaffirmed the policy of four modernizations which, apart from expanding industry, agriculture, and science, envisaged the creation of modern defenses with the object of making China a great and mighty power by the end of the century. The four modern 96 isations are intended to close the gap between China's great power ambitions and its economic and military potential. The aim once set by Mao Zedong and repeatedly confirmed at the 9th, 10th, and 11th Congresses of the CPC that of turning China into a mighty militarist state by the year 2000 requires another big leap. It would be naive to think that in paving the way for these modernizations the Peking leaders will follow the basic law of socialism and work for the harmonious material and spiritual betterment of the people. The modernization of industry, agriculture, and science is intended, above all, to further the Maoists' far-reaching hegemonistic goals and to support preparations for an aggressive war. No secret is being made of this in China. An article in the journal Hunky on the 20th anniversary of the People's Republic of China stresses, "We must see to it that we are in every respect prepared for war when it begins. The best and the most thorough preparation for it are the four modernizations." That could not have been put more candidly and clearly. In the meantime, too impatient to wait until the modernization of industry and science yields fruit, Peking is out to obtain weaponry and military technology from various capitalist countries. The numerous Chinese delegations that have of late been visiting Western military proving grounds and factories are evidence of Peking's intention to acquire military electronics, planes and helicopters, anti-tank missiles, engines, and so on, and this in huge quantities. China is looking for technologically perfect weaponry in Western Europe, said the PRC Deputy Foreign Minister Yu Zhan in an interview to El Popolo, an Italian daily, in June 1978. Deng Xiaoping was still more precise: China is prepared to import arms on a big scale, and we are going to do it. The visit of U.S. Defense Secretary Harold Brown to Peking exposed the militarist ambitions of both the United States and China, and also Washington's intention to encourage military handouts to the Maoists. In other words, the aims and methods of China's modernization as conceived by the present Peking leaders are not just candidly militaristic in nature, but are also taking the country still farther to the right towards a closer alliance with imperialism. Current processes in China are clear evidence that the 497 modernizations are purely and simply a total mobilization of all conceivable means and resources to turn the country into a powerful militarist state strong enough to claim world supremacy. That Maoist China will stick at nothing was shown by its dirty assault on the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. On February 17, 1979, flouting elementary international principles, the Peking leaders started an aggression against their heroic neighbor, whom they had only recently called a friendly state. Here China's present rulers had gone back to the old ways of the Chinese feudal lords, imperialists and colonialists, who had so often attempted to conquer sovereign neighbor countries. The world has not forgotten that only a few years ago the Vietnamese had upheld their freedom and independence in a long and bloody war against U.S. aggression. That time they had fought an imperialist predator. This time they were perfidiously attacked by a country that professes to be socialist. Once again Peking stood before the world as a danger to all humanity, a force plotting a big war and capable of pushing the world over the brink. The perils to peace of Peking's policy are proved by the fact that no other country is more consistent and dogged than China in opposing the relaxation of international tensions. Not once has Peking supported a peace move of any sort, or a step limiting the arms race, or any measure furthering confidence and cooperation. On the contrary, China's rapid militarization, its aggressive conduct towards its neighbors, its expansionist policy and incitement of armed conflict in various parts of the world, all this makes it a highly dangerous source of war. And the peoples may have to pay a high price for underestimating this danger, irrespective of their present-day relations with China or their country's distance from the Middle Kingdom. The Peking leaders' backing of the counter-revolutionary forces in Afghanistan and of the military preparations in the United States are added proof of this. Peking makes brazen territorial claims on the Soviet Union and other neighboring countries. It is stepping up military preparations and brainwashing the Chinese people and armed forces in the spirit of an inevitable war against social imperialism, as the Soviet Union is called in China these days. For Peking anti-98. Sovietism has, in effect, become an all-purpose principle and criterion, and anything detrimental to the Soviet Union causes the Maoists to rejoice. The Chinese leaders continue to aggravate their relations with the USSR. This shows that the anti-Soviet element in Peking's policy is not temporary and tactical, but long-term and strategic. This grave menace must not be taken lightly. The Maoist danger and threat of war calls for constant vigilance. The imperialist states, which are giving additional impetus to the flywheel of the arms race, are making the most of Peking's incendiary, anti-socialist policy. Modern militarism, which controls the commanding heights in the state apparatus of the imperialist states, is able to so influence the various elements of its political mechanism that these function chiefly in the interests of the military-industrial complex. But the crisis of the politico-military concepts based on brute force has caused certain shifts of accent in militarism's influence on the foreign policy of the imperialist powers. A number of points could be made in this connection. In the case of capitalist countries organized in various politico-military alliances, the militarist forces are seeking to tighten the bonds of Atlantic solidarity and impart fresh ideas to the declining imperialist military blocs. Under the present politico-military doctrine of the United States, one that is also, in effect, the doctrine of NATO, special emphasis is laid on the idea of so-called partnership. Once the camouflage of hollow rhetoric is pulled off, the term implies the principal capitalist power's desire to shift as much as possible of the arms spending burden on its allies, that is, to increase their contribution to the defense of the free world. Still, one is unavoidably struck by the presence of a whole string of permanent contradictions in the politico-military sphere. In fact, the sole political basis for the military integration of the capitalist countries is anti-communism and anti-Sovietism, or their fear of current and impending social changes in the capitalist world. No matter how they inflate the lie of a Soviet war threat. 99. The NATO Council sessions and those of other aggressive blocs are not always able to coordinate the military efforts of the imperialist powers. For many members of the alliance, the militarist burden is simply becoming insupportable, which is evidence of the historical limitations of capitalist integration on a militarist basis. Quite clearly, such integration has no future. In the case of the developing countries, militarism is influencing the foreign policy of the imperialist states to encourage the emergence and maintenance mainly of reactionary military bureaucratic regimes that mercilessly suppress progressive movements. The negative influence of militarism on social processes there may also be traced to the fact that the army is often the only influential and organized force in these countries. Frequently, the nature of change in a country depends on the social and political orientation of its military leaders. Though, of course, the higher the degree of organization and influence achieved by the progressive forces, the communist and workers' parties, the trade unions and the mass of the people, the easier it is to control the events and processes occurring in society. The militarists' influence on the policy of capitalist states towards third world countries is of a neo-colonialist complexion. As a rule, they support extreme reactionary military dictatorships and assist them generously in suppressing progressive regimes. But the influence of militarism on the making and conduct of the capitalist states' foreign policy is felt most strongly in their relations with socialist countries. And to support their various militarist moves and measures, capitalist rulers invoke the postulate of a Soviet war threat. The mechanism through which militarization influences imperialism's foreign policy evolved at the time of the Cold War. To restructure it is an intricate proposition that takes a long time. When its elements were pieced together, they were directed to making foreign policy dependent on the politico-military concepts of the military establishment, the interests of the military-industrial complex, and on strategic military considerations. And this mechanism has in substance survived intact, though Cold War ramparts have been either pulled down or breached in many areas of the contest between the two systems. Hence the endless forays of the positions from strength devotees. Hence the anti-100 Soviet campaigns. Hence the outcry to reverse the present line of détente, and so on. The views of political leaders and military theorists who are nursing outdated militarist schemes and see unchecked arming and military build ups as the only way of reaching their aims, are still predominant. And it is no accident that the chief opponents of détente are in the militarist camp, in the fold of monopolies that had for years advocated war and thereby pocketed vast super profits. H. Baldwin, a militant anti-communist and inveterate champion of a militarist course, holds that these days nothing but armed force can secure the West's political aims. Sooner or later, he says, the engagement of the armed forces that have been built in the world would lead to a universal war. Obviously, these theorists and politicians have drawn few or no lessons from recent events. They are blind to the fact that new realities have come into force in international relations. Banking on the mailed fist in the contest with the socialist community and experience has borne this out, can no longer offer any satisfactory chances or hopes of success. 4. The features of the present period in the fight of the CPSU and the other fraternal parties against militarism and aggression, and for the assertion of the peaceful coexistence principle in international relations, have been examined in the works and speeches of Leonid Brezhnev. The Soviet Communist Party and the Soviet government are working perseveringly, firmly and consistently to further the peace program. They are trying to bring home to certain elements in the capitalist states that the socialist system is an increasingly decisive factor in world affairs, that this is an irreversible fact, and that it is useless to deal with the socialist countries from positions of nuclear blackmail, threats, and political and military pressure. But there are still forces in the capitalist world who see peaceful coexistence as merely a means of gaining certain advantages over the probable adversary. The socialist countries, on the other hand, are doing everything to fill the Leninist principle of peaceful coexistence with the 101 greatest possible positive and palpable content, and see it as an important class-based means of securing their goals. Peaceful coexistence is above all a renunciation of war as a means of settling interstate contradictions and disputes. The essential contradiction of the times that between socialism and capitalism manifests itself in diverse forms. And the historic task is to use all possible instruments short of armed force, political, economic, diplomatic, ideological, and so on, to settle that contradiction. In present conditions, says the program of the CPSU, peaceful coexistence of socialist and capitalist states is an objective necessity for the development of human society. Peace is the sole alternative to nuclear war. But Marxists are not blindly opposed to all wars in general. They are opposed to unjust, imperialist wars, and wars of conquest. The peaceful coexistence of states with different systems does not rule out revolutionary civil wars of the working people for their social emancipation or national liberation wars against imperialist aggression. The basic elements of peaceful coexistence are renunciation of war as a means of settling disputes between states, consideration for each other's interests, non-interference in the internal affairs of other states and peoples, strict respect for the territorial integrity of all countries, an extension of economic and cultural cooperation on the basis of complete equality and benefit. And all this is in keeping with the long-term interests of all working people, offering them more favorable conditions for achieving their revolutionary goals. Peaceful coexistence requires consistent and complete observance of signed international agreements and commitments. ******. In sum, maintenance of détente and firm rebuff to forces of aggression imply combating various antipodes of détente, above all militarism, and this without surcease. For militarism today, too, is not merely a dangerous material means of securing imperialism's aims by armed force, but also for certain quarters a hardened mental stereotype, a kind of class-based postulate of their world outlook. 102. Combating militarism and exposing the fabrications of militarist ideologues is a highly relevant task. Present-day militarism hangs on the big social lie that the capitalist West is exposed to a war threat from the Soviet Union and the other socialist states. The truth, of course, is that there is no Soviet threat either for the West or the East. All that is a monstrous lie from beginning to end. The Soviet Union is farthest from the thought of attacking anyone. It needs no war. But since there are still forces in the capitalist world that have not given up plans of regaining lost positions by armed force, it is doing what it must to keep its defenses at the requisite modern level. Our defense expenditures, as Leonid Brezhnev said, are no greater and no less than what is needed to ensure the security of the Soviet Union and to defend the gains of socialism jointly with the fraternal countries. Request to readers. Progress Publishers would be glad to have your opinion of this book, its translation and design, and any suggestions you may have for future publications. Please send all your comments to 17, Zubovsky Boulevard, Moscow, USSR. Progress Publishers.